very good morning. It's my pleasure today to welcome scholars, artists, journalists, and reporters. I'm honored to be in the same session with Professor Marvin Carlson, the emeritus professor, distinguished professor. Later on, I will say why, to me. Professor Marvin Carlson is specialized in comparative literature, theater and performance, Middle Eastern studies in City University of New York. Now I'm telling why. Professor Carlson's book, Theater, a very short introduction, which I have translated into Arabic, is now a textbook in MA Theater Studies in KAU, in the Arabic department, in KAU, King Abdulaziz University, Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. So thank you. Everybody who's studying MA now is getting to know theater to the bone. Thank you so much. Professor Carlson, would you please start your performance and geographies of knowledge, power in theater studies? Please, thank you. Would you please, or you want to stay here? What do you think? Yes.
This right? Good. Okay. First of all, of course, I want to thank Khalid Amin and his many colleagues and students for organizing this wonderful conference. Seeing the slideshow before yesterday's performances and talks, I was impressed again by what a wonderful collection of organizational meetings of this kind Khalid has organized over the years, now in its 20th year. I've been pleased and honored to attend several of these and always found them exciting, stimulating, a great source of connection with exciting theater people from all over the world. And so this now, another repeated occasion gives me a chance to sum up and say once again, what a wonderful contribution this has been. I'll be speaking today about pedagogy and performance, of course, but also I want to add a third term that I think needs to be almost always factored into the relationship between performance and pedagogy and their cultural placement. And that third term is geography. Where and in what circumstances these two human activities have developed, have interacted, and continue to interact. So, theater, to begin with pedagogy then. Theater first began to be studied as a scholarly subject toward the end of the 19th century in universities in Germany. The originator of theater pedagogy was Professor Max Hermann in Berlin. By that time, the modern university had been firmly established in Europe, and particularly in Germany. And this served as the creator of human knowledge, the collector of human knowledge, and the distributor of human knowledge. In modern times, this has been dominated by a relatively small number of universities around the world, particularly in Europe. It is only in the past 50 years or so that the global intellectual community has begun to realize the limitations of this situation. Many significant areas of human culture, theater and performance being among them, have been almost exclusively studied and understood from a particular and narrow geographical perspective. They were a field of study created in Europe, by and large for Europeans, and essentially concerned only with European subject matter. This orientation continues to dominate the field today, although it is clear that the outlines of a more global and comprehensive intellectual model are emerging. What I hope to do today is to explore how the modern study of theater and performance developed and how it was essentially called into being and shaped by the specific geographies of knowledge and power of the 19th and 20th century when it was established. Having traced that history, I will then try to suggest how its limitations began to be revealed and resisted in modern times, and how this process is continuing today. The study of drama is deeply rooted in Western scholarship, grounded, like most Western thought, in classic Greece. Not only did classic Greece determine which human activities were worthy of study and pedagogy and which were not, but it also studied how that study should be conducted, how pedagogy should be pursued. Drama was a field of knowledge considered worthy of study, but only within certain boundaries, which have limited the field of Western drama ever since. First, not surprisingly, was a geographical limitation. The Greeks were certainly aware of a wide range of other cultures, but non-Greeks, collectively referred to as barbarians, were at best inferior, both intellectually and culturally, and at worst, candidates for conquest or enslavement. Drama was considered an art form created by and developed uniquely by the Greeks, unknown to other people, a geographical and cultural mark of superiority carried on by Western theater theorists in general. A second, equally arbitrary feature of drama, as the Greeks defined it, was that it was almost entirely concerned with the written literary text, with little, if any, attention to its physical production, a point that has been made in several of the papers already presented at this conference. Aristotle confirmed this continuing bias in his only and very short comment about theater performance in the Poetics, and I quote, "Spectacle has indeed an emotional attraction of its own, but of all the parts of drama, it is the least artistic, and connected least with the art of poetry. For the power of tragedy, we may be sure, is felt even apart from representation and actors. Besides, the production of spectacular effects depends more on the art of the stage machinist than in that of the poet," unquote. These arbitrary assumptions about the nature of theater, both geographical and material, established in classic times in the West, remained almost unchallenged as the European Renaissance used classic models, often unquestioned, as the foundation for the modern intellectual world, shaped and developed in Western universities. This meant that young scholars in Europe, from the Renaissance onward, if they were interested in theater, studied largely or entirely only the written drama as a branch of literature produced in a certain area of the world. Thus, drama as a branch of literature, specifically German literature, was what Max Herrmann studied at the University of Berlin in the 1880s. The subject of his first lectures, and this is the beginning then, of drama pedagogy, as a professor was quite traditional, a detailed study of a minor play by Goethe, the acknowledged master of the German drama. Hermann's lectures, however, were strikingly different from the conventional approach. Although he discussed the sources of the play, the language and the imagery, the plot and the characterization, he added to this analysis something new, rarely if ever discussed by literary scholars, and that was a brief history of different productions of the play on the German stage. Hermann elaborated and defended this new approach in a major book on the history of the German theater in 1914. This led the University of Berlin to award him with the first chair of theater studies, and in 1923 to establish the first Institute for Theater Studies anywhere in the world. Despite this official recognition, however, Hermann and his new subject of study encountered much opposition from older established disciplines that were still based on language and the written text. Although the study of theater as a performed art is now generally well established throughout the Western world, and as a result of European colonialism in academic institutions around the world, it has never been entirely escaped a somewhat negative opinion by traditional text-oriented scholars who have always felt that it is not as fully academic as text-based studies like philosophy, literature, or history. This continuing tension at the heart of theater studies has been accompanied by other tensions as the field has developed within Western culture. Of particular importance was the fact that by the time Max Hermann began to study the physical conditions of performance, these conditions had become largely solidified throughout Europe. Over the centuries, Europe has seen an enormous variety of theatrical styles of performance. But when Hermann studied the production history of a classic German play, he was familiar with only a single mode of production, which has been essentially the same when he himself staged the play almost a century later, when Hermann studied it. This was, of course, the familiar proscenium stage, sometimes called the European stage, which was invented during the Italian Renaissance and had become, by the late 19th century, almost universal in Europe. Moreover, thanks to colonialism, this European-style stage was accepted in much of the world as the only proper way to present the art known as theater. Just as the proscenium stage had become almost universally accepted in Europe and its colonies as the distinguishing mark of the art known as theater, other European assumptions and practices were similarly generally adopted. Among these were the same spatial arrangements, an audience divided into auditorium, balconies, and boxes, facing a proscenium frame stage surrounded by wings, drops, flies, and footlights, and even with highly predictable exterior architectural decoration. The association with a literary tradition was preserved also. European theater, unlike theater in much of the world, remained closely tied to the written text, so much so that plays based on music, most notably opera, were almost never accepted in Western universities as part of theater studies, but if studied at all, were almost invariably taught in departments of music. Creators of opera, like Verdi or Mozart, were not considered theater artists. That term was reserved for literary figures like Shakespeare or Molière. The close tie in the West between literature and theater not only discouraged Western scholars in the Hermann tradition from paying any attention to musical forms like opera, but even to theater forms that were not literary, such as circus, variety shows, or the many forms of popular comedy and melodrama. For much of the first century, the field of theater studies thus remained a highly limited one, much constrained by its own cultural assumptions. Just as Europe, especially Western Europe, was considered the model for all other cultures everywhere, so the theater it had developed was considered the highest, perhaps the only expression of true theater art. The close ties between literature, geography, pedagogy, and theater meant that the first Western theater scholars, like Hermann, confined their studies to their own language and culture. Gradually, the field became more international as German theater scholars began to study Shakespeare and English scholars Molière. Nevertheless, that internationalization remained confined to Europe and carefully selected European traditions. When the International Federation for Theater Research, the first such international group, was formed in 1955, it consisted of 21 members, only one of which, Japan, was from outside Europe. The textbooks devoted to the developing field of Europe reflected this same geographical bias. A contemporary of Max Hermann's, Karl Mansius, a leading actor in Copenhagen, shared Hermann's interest in the history of theatrical production, and perhaps because of his own professional background in performance and not in the university, his interests were not restricted to a specific language or culture. His 6-volume work, Skuespilkunst Historie, was published from 1897 to 1906 and began to appear in English in 1903, even before it was completed. Although Mansius, like Hermann, saw theater as an essentially European art, he introduced a major elaboration in the field, which permanently altered the mental geography of this study. Although 5 3/4 of his 6 volumes dealt only with Europe, the opening part of the first volume, about 75 pages, was entitled Primitive Theaters. The 3 primitive theaters briefly discussed were those of classical China, Japan, and India. From this time onward, these 3 Asian traditions were almost always included in the histories of theater that began to appear in various European languages, although they were invariably encountered before or after the standard Greek to modern European story, and really only briefly covered. Often with rather subtly conceived indications of their primitiveness and lack of development. In Chinese theater, for example, was dismissed in 2 pages in the largest of the theater histories, Friedley and Reeves, with the title Incomprehensible China, which is a typical dismissive adjective. As cultural studies grew more global in the late 20th century, the limitations of the Mansius and Hermann model, with its highly selective European emphasis and its Darwinian view of the development of this, became increasingly apparent. At the same time, however, 2 new related developments within theater studies itself provided tools and strategies for a much more comprehensive view of this art, both geographically and conceptually. The first to appear was the academic recognition of popular culture as a field of studies in the United States in the early 1970s. Like the new approach developing at the same time among historians, generally known as history, quote, from the bottom up, proponents of popular culture argued that previous work in their field had been extremely elitist, devoted almost entirely to the interest, taste, and experience of the upper classes. Not surprisingly then, the new interest in popular culture in American studies and general historical studies was soon followed by a similar development in theater studies, with the leading journals in the field presenting special issues on popular theater, and in 1977 organizing the first national conference devoted specifically to popular theater. Not surprisingly, this expansion of the field was resisted in theater, as it was in cultural studies generally, by traditional scholars who felt that the academic standing of the field in general would be lessened if it began to explore less elite forms of entertainment. There is no question that the rise of interest in popular culture considerably expanded, however, the range of theater scholarship, a process even further accelerated by the appearance of performance studies during this same period, especially as championed by Professor Richard Schechner, its leading theorist. Performance studies significantly supported this attack on the elitism and Eurocentrism of traditional theater studies already begun by popular culture studies. It expanded the potential range of the field much further, however, by treating the traditional subject of theater study as only a small part of a much larger field of human activity that included performance. This included not only the non-literary entertainments open to study by popular culture, such as circuses and vaudevilles, but also a wide range of other performance activities, including religious rituals, sporting events, and all sorts of public celebrations. The growing importance of the continued pressures of popular cultural studies and performance studies have certainly altered the field of theater studies, even though as a discipline it still maintains much of the cultural elitism and Eurocentrism that marked it from the very beginning. Still, the field, like the International Academy itself, continues to expand its boundaries and question its assumptions, surely a healthy intellectual process, even though much remains to be done. Morocco is an excellent location in which to consider the history and the future of theater studies. Although Morocco is one of the varieties of secular and religious performance forms, including both classic and modern Western-style theater, Morocco remains almost completely absent from any standard history of the theater, even those claiming to be histories of world theater. Morocco suffers from a double discrimination in the eyes of European censored theater historians. First, it is in Africa, an entire continent considered almost without theater until very recent times. And in addition to that, it is part of the Islamic world, which in the eyes of most Western scholars makes it culturally incapable of understanding or promoting this art. Unquestionably, the most widely read and quoted theater history in the past 100 years was Oscar Brockett's History of the Theater, first published in 1968, and after that, often referred to, as in English at least, as the Bible of theater history. This book changed and expanded in later editions as the field itself changed, but its view of the impossibility of theater in the Islamic world remained the same in the 21st century as it had in the beginning, in essentially the same words. In the 9th edition, in 2003, for example, we find this pronouncement, and I quote from Brockett. In the history of the theater, Islam is largely a negative force. It forbade artists to make images of living things because Allah was said to be the only creator of life, and to compete with him was considered a mortal sin. Thus, Islamic art remained primarily decorative rather than representational. These prohibitions extended to the theater, and consequently, in those areas where Islam became dominated, advanced theatrical forms were stifled. I note to call your attention to also the pejorative term advanced. It may be the Islam could do primitive theater like the Chinese, but not advanced theater like the West. It may seem astonishing that the West's leading historian could write these words 30 years after the performance of the Iranian Tazia at the Shiraz Festival opened the eyes of Peter Brook and other Western theater leaders to a major form of theater that was centrally and specifically Islamic. But Iran, like Morocco, was simply outside the geographical and cultural boundaries that had been established to privilege Western theater. A figure I have found of particular personal importance in demonstrating how the geographical and cultural biases of Western scholarship have limited theater and performance studies is the 13th century Egyptian puppet master Ibn Daniel. Ibn Daniel was a figure almost totally unknown a century ago, even in the Arab world, although he is today becoming ever more widely recognized as one of the most original and provocative dramatists in history, and arguably the most significant dramatist in the world during the late European medieval period. The recognition of Ibn Daniel has been possible due to the development in the field of theater history brought about by the challenges to Eurocentric elitism mounted by internationalism, performance studies, and popular culture. Ibn Daniel is an almost perfect example of the sort of figure sought by microhistory, studying history from the bottom up. He lived and worked among the lowest classes of Cairo society, the itinerant street entertainers at the public markets. Many of them, like Ibn Daniel himself, were not even citizens, but were transients or refugees. Ibn Daniel's own situation was depressingly similar to that of many thousands in the world today. He had taken refuge in Egypt to escape the war ravaging his native city of Mosul in present-day Iraq. Even his particular form of theater, the puppet show, has only recently been recognized as worthy of pedagogical study in traditional scholarship, despite its enormous importance in the non-European world. The remarkably sophisticated plays of Ibn Daniel were not only outstanding products of late medieval popular culture, but moreover provide specific documentation of that culture, showing a wide variety of the everyday activities, respectable and not, of everyday Egyptians and street performers who entertained them. The recently discovered plays of this author provide a single but significant example of the broadening of the field by such geographical and cultural expansion. Beginning with the plays themselves, their discovery made a major addition to traditional studies of medieval drama, not only by bringing a group of important new works into the canon, previously thought to have produced no drama in this part of the world, but also giving particular information about the workings of that culture, as theater always does. The contributions of this discovery merely begin there. While the narrative material and the dramatic organization of the Greek tragic poets has been widely imitated and equally widely commented upon by Western historians, It has often been noted that neither the dramatic subjects nor the highly distinctive plot arrangements of the only preserved Greek comic writer, Aristophanes, have been imitated by any known subsequent dramatist. One of Ibn Daniel's plays, however, follows in detail the precise and complex plot structure of an aristocratic comedy. Although geographically the two dramatists were not far apart, the vast difference in time would at first glance make this a remarkable coincidence, even though no other known dramatist has done this. In fact, though, the history of the Eastern Mediterranean provides a possible explanation. At this period, Greek drama, though apparently not produced, was universally studied in the Byzantine universities, and the humor, as well as the love of sexual material, made Aristophanes a particular favorite. In the latter part of his career, when the extant plays were written, Ibn Daniel was serving as court poet to the Mamluk royal family in Cairo at a time when the Mamluks had particularly close cultural and economic relations to Byzantium. The close cultural content provided a poet at the Mamluk court an excellent opportunity for exposure to the work of the Greek author. However, Western theater scholarship has not looked at this at all because it's all taking place over in and around Turkey and the Middle East, an area notoriously neglected by European theater historians, partly for linguistic reasons, but mostly for cultural ones. Another of Ibn Daniel's plays suggests an even more extensive way that a study of his work can expand the borders, geographical and conceptual, of traditional European theater history. The play is composed almost entirely, this one play, is composed almost entirely of the public speeches of the street entertainers of the period, magicians, acrobats, animal trainers, potion salesmen, fortune tellers, and so on. First, from the simple concept of popular culture, these specific examples of the activities of medieval street entertainers provide a collection of primary material unique in the world, partially, of course, because they are not, quote, literary, unquote. Beyond that, however, they offer a challenging opportunity to trace geographical networks of performance activity that traditional theater scholarship has never attempted. As I have noted, Ibn Daniel himself and many of the street performers with whom he performed and whom he recreates in his work were political refugees from Mosul in Iraq. Mosul, like its sister city Baghdad, was known as being a center of such activity, with performers who appeared there traveling east and west along the Silk Road that connected Europe with the Far East. Although Ibn Daniel himself is not known to have visited Byzantium, imperial records there note that street entertainers from Cairo were particularly prominent there. Popular entertainments having been largely ignored by traditional theater historians, these hints from the Middle East open the possibility of major new geographies of theater research. The street performers in Ibn Daniel's work present material almost identical to that of medieval Europe. Exploring the relations between performers in Egypt, Byzantium, and along the Silk Road with those in medieval Europe open a vast area of research still largely unexplored. Such possibilities suggest something of the enormous possibilities offered by our expanding geographical and cultural expansion of the kind of idea of theater and performance, and of course its pedagogy. The weight of tradition maintained in textbooks and in much of the academic establishment still tends to greet these new directions with indifference or even hostility. But the combined forces of globalization and the fascination of new discoveries will surely continue to, nevertheless, to expand and revitalize this field of study. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Marvin Carlson. Thank you so much. Thank you for this insightful presentation of the history of performances, going from west to east, Japan, China, Morocco, and in Islam in At-Taziyah form, and Ibn Daniel in Egypt, and finally in Iraq. So thank you for this call to free the geographies from the boundaries and limitations of the European perspective. It has been really informative, and now I open the discussion, the questions for the scholars and reverend audience, please.
Marvin, good morning. Thank you very much for such an enlightening keynote speech, you know, in the morning. So to digest all, let me start with the Palgrave, you know, Handbook of Theatre Censorship. I know that later you want to announce something about it. It's right there in the back. Okay. So, yeah, you can say something about it, you know, but not, anyway, after my question.
There's the condition.
Yeah,
right. Yeah. So my question relates actually to the geographies. I was extremely, you know, impacted on about the idea of primitive cultures while talking on primitive theaters, particularly while talking about India and Japan. And ironically, these cultures, performative cultures, were behind, you know, all these booming in the 1960s onwards in terms of the, you know, practice of intercultural theater. So my question, it's really about this decolonial perspective, about historiography. So I believe that Europe has been the silent reference of world theater histories, and this has been going on and on and on. And you say that, you know, IFTR started with one person from Japan, and now, of course, it has its own revolution from inside, trying, you know, after the intercultural war to get rid of all this Eurocentric or Anglo-American, you know, domination. My question is about what about the decolonial perspectives and options that we can have on the table, and especially thinking about the global south and thinking from here, from our position in Morocco, Africa, and of course, when I say the global south, I mean it's really a global coalition between people like you and me and Richard, and you know, it's not necessarily coming from NYU or from you know, Berlin to be thinking in this way, but definitely it has much to do with an état d'esprit, very simply. So again, the decolonial perspective can start already by decolonizing the local history or local narrative of Greek, you know, tragedy that was somehow universalized and as a starting point, etc. And then we can go back to decolonize, you know, this narrative, and of course bringing to the fore other local narratives, including Ibn Daniel's, for example, that you mentioned. The problem with this option is precisely related to the question of the archive. And you know very much that, you know, the text of and manuscripts of Ibn Daniel, we can't find them except by traveling to Istanbul, Egypt, and somewhere else. and compiling, it's very difficult actually enterprise, to search into the archives of these texts like Ibn Daniel, like the miniatures, for example. You should travel to Netherlands and to somewhere else in order to retrieve these archives. So it's again a question of the archive. It's a question of retrieving other lost or narratives that were edited out from the mainstream historiography. And maybe a third option is to open up what is called entangled histories, or les histoires croisées, meaning very simply seeing different narratives but from different perspectives and positions. Thank you.
Yes, let me focus in on what you say about archives. I think that's sort of a key concept. This is a very complicated question. One very great difficulty that has always faced, and particularly now faces people involved with the pedagogy of performance and theater, is to work against the combined assumption that theater is a European phenomenon, or performance is a European phenomenon, and the very closely related performance is that it's based on literary texts. Both of those are still widely accepted, and while partially true, need to be countered and resisted. Here's where archives come in. Ibn Daniel is a good example in a number of cases. On the one hand, Ibn Daniel was well known for several hundred years before he was discovered as a playwright, because he also cleverly wrote poetry, and his poetry was known. Even some poems that came from the plays were forgotten. So there is an archival question, because one wonders what the archives are, or what you consider them to be. To broaden that question a little further, well, first of all, let me stay in the traditional area. Even if we were good archival historians, there are far too few of us. I'm speaking internationally about theater researchers and teachers. There are far too few of us that know any non-European or non-Middle Eastern languages. How many scholars of Byzantine theater are there? And probably Byzantium is one of the two or three, maybe the, aside from Cairo, most important theater, most important city in the history of performance. How many people have the languages to work there? The Far East, Africa, every place you look, even if you just stick to traditional archives, that is to say, written materials. But then, of course, it's critically important that is, as performance historians, we think of the non-literary archive, the archive of bodily movement, that much interesting work has been done in the last 20, 30 years. But we're just getting started, and even recognizing that is another kind of archive that should be just as important to us, is something that, like performance in general, is still an idea that is growing, but it's still European and American oriented. So there is just as much work to be done.
And about the book, please. Dr. Khalid, you asked for some comment on the book?
sorry.
about the new book to be launched.
Oh, well, I guess, will we have examination copies of the book here, Khalid, do you know? I got.
Maybe you can use this one, please.
I'm sorry. Khalid, will we have examination copies of the new book here? Or you and I have received copies on email, but I don't know what's available for people to look at here.
I think it's an e-book. Yeah, they can download the whole.
All right, yes, okay. Again, I think another indication of the growing interest of this is how many different presses like Palgrave are now doing really international studies of different operations in the theater. Khalid and I have worked on this collection on critique and criticism and censorship, a very complicated and very geographically determined study. Tomorrow, Erica Fischer-Lichter will be introducing her book from Interweaving Performance Cultures. Again, Khalid and I have worked in part on that. All of these are attempting to broaden people's vocabulary, both performative and literary, in speaking of these combined arts.
Thank you. There's a question from Professor Richard Checkner, please. Sorry, please. Sorry. Yes, please, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see.
No, it's okay. My name is Najib Bounahai. I'm from Morocco. And I knew you, Marvin, in print before I could see you in person. And I have to give you the credit for giving, although a brief mention, to Averroes' translation of Aristotle's Poetics. I remember in the early 90s, we used your textbook, as doctoral students. And a lot of students were asking me, being somebody from the Arab world, from North Africa, to talk to them further about how could this be sidelined in standard textbooks, of course, of either theater history or textbooks of dramatic theory. And you mentioned Oscar Brockett, who was based at the University of Texas. The first time I had met him again in print was through the 4th edition, of course, of the Theater of Theater. But there is, of course, no mention, of course, of the Middle East or North Africa, for that matter. I do have a remark and then a question. The first remark, I think that this interest in other theaters that originated from what may be called the Global South, I think this interest came as a result of pressure from the student body in mostly North American universities. In the 90s, I think there was so much emphasis on diversity, and I think that the student body put pressure on educational authorities at the university to diversify, and in some cases even to decolonize theater studies. And I witnessed it myself. I could see that the people around me in the Department of Drama and Dance in the Boston area were asking for Chicano theater, were asking for Hispanic theater, were asking for Afro-American theater. And I think this was part of an ecosystem that developed across many lines: cultural studies, gender studies, post-colonial studies, race and ethnic studies. and all the rest of it. So I related, of course, to multicultural policy. You can't just, of course, diversify at an institution level without, reviewing the canon. And I was speaking a little earlier to Richard Cheshner, and I was taught by one of his students, and he was the first one to interest me in Asian theater. And when I discovered Asian theater, Western theater paled in comparison. And he pushed me to work on Wei Young Kolik, and he told me, I want to know to what extent Islam proselytizers back in the 16th century, how did they feel about Wei Young Kolik? And what I found was just amazing. When I read Shakuntala, when I read Shastra, I just said, okay, I mean, I read poetics 500 years before Common Era. Now I am discovering a text that existed well before Common Era. And so this is my comment. My question to you, you mentioned, of course, the interest in theater studies in late 19th century, and mostly in Germany. Gave us, of course, Wagner and his idea of total theater, and later on Max Hannah-Hayden. But this is actually a genuine question. How do you feel about those avant-garde directors, from Artaud, who was fascinated with Balinese theater, which he didn't see, he saw it at the Colonial Exhibition in Paris, by the way. Fascinated with Mexican native Indian performance. Then Peter Brook with Mahabharata and Ramayana. I can go on, and even Ariane Mnuchin, when she did Agamemnon, she gave it a totally oriental sort of dimension, and she said, before I am Greek, I am Japanese, Balinese, and Chinese. And so is it a matter of cultural appropriation? Or did these people, did they do service, of course, to these great traditions, of course, from mostly, the Orient? Thank you. Sorry, I spoke for too long, but...
Well, you touch on a variety of important, interesting questions. Let me just start near where you ended, and that is, when I was younger, quite a long time ago, I was very negative about the Orientalist use of people like Ariane Mnuchin and Peter Brook. I felt this was kind of cultural appropriation. I loved them as creative artists, but it seemed to me that they were diminishing or misrepresenting something essential. I've gotten much more comfortable with that as I've gotten older. Today I feel that one of the things that is really very central to theater is hybridity. And not only is this essential, but it's inevitable and even good. That is, every imaginative, interesting new production of Hamlet is a negotiation with a tradition that makes changes. If it's any good, it makes changes. It's a new blend. And that is one of the things that makes theater what it is. And that is a cultural matter, too. I think I can imagine a director that says, I want to exactly reproduce a no drama on stage. First of all, I doubt if they are able to do it, but if they did, fine, that's interesting, I want to see that. But also somebody like Mishima or a Western director says, I'm going to take the idea, or like Yates, I'll take no drama and I'm going to do something entirely different with it. That's fine too. Was it a good idea for Brecht to go to Mai Lang Fong and totally misunderstand what Mai Lang Fong was doing? Sure, wonderful, because interesting new things come out of it. If you're a purist and you say, well, he's corrupted the original, I understand that. But I think it tries to deny something that is inevitable, and that is that things change as they move around from community to community and culture to culture. That's going to happen anyway, and I think we should, by and large, enjoy that process. And I think teach our students to enjoy it, to say, all right, don't ask, is this the right production, or is this like the original production, or whatever? But what are the merits and interests of this in itself? And I do think if part of that analysis means that they themselves need to look into some of the influences and backgrounds, fine. But as a way of illuminating the experience, not of critiquing it for not being faithful to an original. I'm sorry, I also went on too long, but you raise a lot of interesting questions.
Thank you, Marvin. Very interesting paper. I have a couple of reflections and also a question. For the first reflection, I think, as I said in my own keynote, if you look at any form, they're not original. Let's take no drama, if you want to, in Japan. It's very, very established, but you can go back and say it comes from Saragaku, which is a folk dance form. Then Kanami, the father of Zeami, more or less instituted what we now know as No, and it tries to preserve itself. So I don't support what Aristotle said about the Greek drama, but what he said was, of course, it was dithyrambic dance, and then Dionysius came in. It's also a hybrid. Human culture is a hybrid. We know that the species originated in Africa at the Olduvai Gorge, Lucy, maybe a few people, maybe less than in this room. And then we went all over the world, this species. So obviously we are the same. We go back to one source. And obviously we are different. Right now, I think we're in the midst of a plague of identity crisis. In other words, I call it a plague because I look around this room and I say, yes, there are different cultures here. Is this proscenium stage we're sitting in Moroccan? Is it American? The University of New England, I've never heard of it in New England. What is it? I look at people, how they're dressed. Are you dressed in, quote, your clothes, my clothes, a culture's clothes? In terms of fact, people not only are hybrids, but they can absorb within a generation what was foreign is no longer foreign. We know that about languages. Somebody comes to a country and they can barely speak the language and their children are fluent in it. This is what it means to be a human being, to be able to adapt, to change, and so on and so forth. I thought your paper was very provocative, and I want to ask you a question about what happens 10, 15 years from now. I've been thinking about this. When AI makes it possible for each of us in this room to speak our own language, and anybody else without the earphone hears the language they know. In other words, where in a certain sense the curse of Babel in the Bible is overcome and one can communicate. When one could go to the Byzantium archive, open the text, put one's phone or whatever the successor to the phone will be, and read it in one's own language, as it were. In other words, we're on the verge of a certain kind of communicability that has not existed since the species began, really. Now, this may be good, it may be bad, but, well, I don't think it's going to be bad. I think there are a lot of things that are bad, but I don't think that's bad. So my question is, when you look ahead, because when you talk about some of these people, Oscar Brockett was my teacher in the University of Iowa, and Brooks McNamara, who was one of the originators of popular culture studies, was my student at Tulane University. So, these things go around and around. So I'd like you to look ahead a little bit and deal with this question of what I call cultures of choice, where will each of us have a kind of culture of, like we go into a restaurant. I look around Tangier, and I see Moroccan food, I see Italian food, I see French food, etc. And I think food, as much as anything, food and dress, clothing, these are the marks of popular culture voting for what they want from elsewise. In other words, you don't open a restaurant that nobody comes to. And yet these are cultural things. So what do you feel in terms of performance and the studies of performance as we're moving forward? I know my question and my comments are probably not very organized, but you see the drift of what I'm asking.
Professor Marvin, please, I hope you don't mind we close the session as Professor Najib Munai is starting the next one. So maybe some in the break time, or is it, I don't know.
I'll
Professor
take
Najib,
2 minutes.
Professor Najib.
But we need
Sorry.
to talk further.
Yeah. Sorry, but
But-
I'm limited with the time. Sorry for that, but I have to respect. Thank you.
I mean, I have a lot. Obviously, it's a very provocative question. I have a lot to say about it. Let me say that we won't know till we get there. We had no idea what Zoom theater was or how it would affect us or not affect us until we did it. I think the AI is the same thing. It does seem to me still, and this may just be the who I am or my own background, I still imagine AI or computers or whatever, or Zoom theater, whatever comes along, there is still something very basic in the human condition and psyche that responds to another living being performing in front of you. To be honest, I don't believe that AI will destroy that any more than Zoom theater did. I think it's something. I think it will have more complex relations. We'll have more complex international, global relationships. But I still think that human experience will remain at the heart of theater. I think that's something that's essential. There's a lot more to say about this, but we can talk later.
Thank you so
I
much.
also have something to say about costuming.
Thank you so much. Thank you all, and wish you all the best. Thank you.
We can check. Khalid. Okay, good morning, everyone. A very warm thank you to my dear friend Khalid Amin for putting together this 20th edition of this international event on such a compelling theme, performance and pedagogy. And I am very pleased to moderate this keynote presentation, and we're very delighted to have amongst us today a well-established scholar, Professor Andy Lavender. I don't think I can do full justice to him in a few minutes, but Professor Lavender enjoys an impressive trajectory in pedagogy, design, and even oversight and accreditation. He's currently the Vice President and the Director of Production Art at Guildhall, but prior to that, he had taught and directed programs at universities, mostly in England or the UK for that matter, University of Surrey, University of Warwick, and the Royal Centre or Central School of Speech. I was partly educated at Webber Douglas Academy of Dramatic Art, which is now you, but this was a long time ago. As I said, Professor Lavender is an established scholar in performance studies, but he's really, involved at a very close range into issues related to pedagogy. So he's conducted a lot of accreditation, institution review, and validation, of course, design. In terms of conceptual work, he's associated with concepts such as immersive and participatory theater, multimodal performance, virtual reality theater, and most importantly, he is working on the collaborative multimedia theater, which brings together video, robotics, puppetry, and sound engineering. Professor Lavender, you have the floor, and thank you for graciously accepting to do this. I'm saying it on behalf of my friend Khalid Amin.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Thank you too to Khalid and colleagues for this invitation. I'm honored to be here. Congratulations on your 20th anniversary. Thank you for making the PowerPoint work just in time.
Can you hear us back there?
Yeah, can you hear me? I don't want to get too close because I think it pops if I'm too close. But say if it should be loud. Thank you very much. So this paper is in 4 parts. It addresses 3 specific instances to explore a larger case about refiguring practices and relationships across the conservatoire and arguably theatre industry sectors. The 3 initiatives are all from the school where I work, Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London. Arguably, taken together, they allow us to say something about refigurings in a Western conservatoire at a time of challenge and change in our sector. So Guildhall is located in the City of London. It's next to the Barbican Arts Centre. It offers undergraduate and postgraduate programs across drama, music and production arts. In other words, design, backstage, production management work. It's fair to say that Guildhall has been working in and responding to a context that applies more widely across the conservatoire sector and indeed across higher education in the UK and in other parts of the world too. Challenges here include the project of decolonising, a movement from guru-centred to student-centred pedagogies, an expansion of remit for conservatoires particularly to include public engagement and research, and a remodelling of institutional practices in the wake of social movements, for example, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, also in the wake of the pandemic, and also changing economic circumstances, which are now making things tougher. So I'd like to start with by reporting really a production that we staged at Guildhall, working according to Theatre Green Book principles. So launched in 2021, the Theatre Green Book is a resource for theatres in the UK and beyond. It emerges from a joint initiative designed to develop sustainable theatre practices, which is a matter of facilitating new ways of thinking and making. Theatre production is not untypically wasteful, very high transport costs for goods and people, single-use arrangements and then things get binned, inbuilt redundancy of materials, extensive power consumption. But all of this can be addressed. The carbon footprint of all of those activities can be managed. So the Theatre Green Book is about developing practices to manage the carbon footprint, and it's become quite profoundly a culture change initiative within the theatre industry. It was developed by a mix of architects, engineers, theatre and production consultancies, climate action groups, culture houses, arts organisations, including Borough Happold, Charcoal Blue, and a number of others. And venues including Sadler's Wells and the Royal Opera Theatre, so significant venues in the UK. The second edition of the Theatre Green Book was launched in June 2024, and it includes guidance and orientation for theatre makers and some usable tools as well. It's geared around 3 major areas, and for each area there are specific steps towards managing carbon emissions. So the areas are productions, so putting work on, operations, how you run your activity, and buildings, the venue that the thing is located in. And the steps include preliminary, basic, intermediate, and advanced. And the Theatre Green Book gives you a set of considerations to help you undertake this work. So in the production area, for instance, basic means that 50% of props, costumes and scenery are from reused or recycled materials, and 65% will go on to have a future life. And then the figures scale up depending on which benchmark you aspire to meet. And if you're interested in this, there's an excellent website and a very helpful introductory video on it. The website also includes case studies, and one of these is a pilot production undertaken according to Theatre Green Book parameters at Guildhall School of Music and Drama. So we presented a production of Much Ado About Nothing by Shakespeare, directed by Chelsea Walker and designed by Peo Wang in the Milton Court Theatre at the school in February. I was going to show you some clips from the video that we made to talk through the project, which is on the Theatre Green Book website, but because of the internet access here, I'm not going to try to do that now. But if you're interested, I can share the link. and you could have a look. I would have shown you an excerpt of my colleague Aurelie, who's our sustainability lead, and two students, the student production manager and the student lighting designer, talking about the project. But instead, I'm going to move straight on and just talk about how the Theatre Green Book helps you to manage your carbon emissions. So here's an example of the inventory calculator for costume. And I'm not sure if you can see this very clearly, but you plug in the details concerning various aspects. So in terms of the source of materials, a score of 1, which is the best score, means that the costume team is hiring and reusing materials from local sources. And if you score the worst score, which is 5, then you're using raw materials. And then in terms of the destination, if costumes are returned to storage or donated, that's a score of 1, that's a good score. If they're sent to landfill, that's a score of 5. And then in the overall inventory calculator, you can see the summary. You can perhaps see at the bottom of this form, once everything is tallied together, that our production at the school aspired to meet the baseline standard, but actually met the intermediate, and we were very close to the advanced standard for this particular production. So to draw some conclusions from the project, the students were extraordinarily motivated by this initiative. We had great buy-in from the director and designer. That was important, of course. We had already done work in the Department of Production Arts with each of the subsections, lighting, sound, costume, scenic arts, etc., developing their own sustainability plans and actions. We learnt some things from this project. For example, if you don't have a good record of your itinerary, you don't know where to find things or where to store things. It's very simple, but that kind of housekeeping is important to this activity. The Theatre Green Book process changes the production workflow as well, and that was something that we learned. You have to have more time in advance for planning. How about considering a green card meeting as well as a white card meeting? In the white card meeting, you look at a design concept before it gets finalized. In a green card meeting, you might be looking at the sustainability footprint. And then, of course, this bears upon teaching workflow, how students are introduced to this work, and indeed how it might be figured in their assessments. This kind of work is undertaken in other contexts as well. So we're now seeing publications of case studies. There's a few here from Melbourne, from Norway, from the UK, with some reflections about considerations. There's also a very excellent report that I recommend by Roberta Mock, looking at examples in the professional sector, so a large-scale production, a small-scale production, and a touring production. And it's an indication of the traction that the Theatre Green Book project is now achieving, not just in the UK, but more widely. It's been picked up by the European Theatre Convention, and initially through a series of 10 pilot projects in various institutions, but there are now Theatre Green Book initiatives in Taiwan, Australia, and indeed in the Arabic-speaking theatre world. I won't dwell on this one, but it's just an indicator that there are now sector bodies that are developing tools, protocols, guidance, and training as this becomes more embedded in the theatre industry, and indeed the wider performing arts and film, TV, and media industries. There's also a project here that is run in the United States, the Sustainable Production Toolkit, which, I mean, what I quite like about this work is that it includes some very helpful and, you know, perhaps quite obvious guidance as well, but it's useful to see it. Lastly, before I move on, just to mention that this now chimes with academic work in eco-scenography, for instance, the work of Tanya Beer, and eco-dramaturgy, for instance, the work of Theresa J. May, not to be confused with the former British Prime Minister. If you go to the Theatre Green Book website, it includes, I think, a number of very helpful resources, but including this page of educators' notes. And I wanted to end this section with this, not least because it's just a little reminder that the show will go on, and you know, that's not the whole of life. So you know, let's give ourselves some time and space to look after ourselves and make this work responsibly. For my second instance, I'd like to talk about a different project. This is a digital costume archive pilot, and it's called Array, as in array, the stuff that we wear, and conjoining that with AR for an augmented reality approach. Guildhall successfully applied to the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which is a UK funding body, to the Creative Research Capacity Scheme for some funding for infrastructure. And the scheme was particularly pointing at small specialist institutions, which arguably suffer in a wider research field in relation to universities that are bigger and can leverage more resource. So this scheme was designed to recognize the nearness to industry of the small specialists and then help them to develop research-related infrastructure. And we won some money from this scheme, which allowed us to develop two particular motion capture extended reality setups, one using an optical tracking system and one using a volumetric capture system. They're slightly different, but I won't go into that here. So we then developed the Array project, led by collaborators, colleagues at the school, and working with Angels Costumes, which is a very big costume hire house based in London that services the theatre, opera and film and television industries, and also working with Target 3D, which is a motion capture company developing commercial product and also undertaking research and R&D explorations. What this particular project intended to do was to use augmented reality to create a digital costume archive so that you could see how a costume sat on a body, how it moved when the body moved. You could look at it from different angles. You don't have to visit the costume house in North London, nor do you have to look at a two-dimensional image on a page. So we used this particular volumetric capture system that works through 6 degrees of freedom, which is a kind of technicality of how the capture works. And the costume designer selected a number of costumes that would be challenging to the system and then worked with performers to undertake the capture. The material is then put into a post-production process that allows the files to be accessed either on a computer screen or through a headset, which then allows you to walk around a figure who themselves is in motion. So you can see that the potential applications of this are to give the costume house some better leverage over its assets, to share costumes that it might be hiring out, for designers to make decisions about how things might sit in a production, and also for a workflow that pulls a better calibration of design further forward into the process. Okay, I think for reasons of time, I shall move on to this is different again, and then these things together. So this concerns the Guildhall D Centre for Socially Engaged Practice and Research. And to step back a bit to a broader provenance, this arises in part from the work of my colleague John Sloboda, who was the principal investigator of an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project looking at music for social impact, social impact research in the performing arts. John founded an institute to house the project, but also to build on a longer trajectory of work in the school, really exploring social and community engagement with arts practices. We decided that on John's retirement, rather than continue the institute as it had been conceived, we would set up something different, which has become called the D Centre for Socially Engaged Practice and Research, developed by my colleagues Sophie Hope and Sean Gregory. And the principles are that the D Centre recognises that many arts activities are now defined by their plurality. In other words, not least by their difference and arguably the complexity of their interrelations. The D Centre is interested in exploring alternative models of management and organisation, so not necessarily top-down, but lateral. It examines nuanced interconnections between people, sectors and art forms, and it celebrates diversity and transdisciplinarity and cross-cultural expression. So it's therefore intentionally interested in polyphony rather than what might be conceived as a more patriarchal model of transaction in the performing arts, and indeed in arts education. And currently it operates through internal workings, which are in effect the projects of individuals or perhaps pairs of people, research projects, lines of inquiry. Likewise, the internal workings are curriculum related, and then public engagement as well. And I wanted to just spend a minute connecting this project of decentering with reference to broader social and cultural currents. So, for example, connecting it with the larger impetus of postmodernism to relativize structures and relationships, to flatten hierarchies and challenge the notion of singular or non-contextualized authority and authorship. Separately, the work of decoloniality has been significant and remains significant in education and more widely in cultural productions over recent years. And you know, we might think historically that work is still in an early phase. To quote Warsha Mignolo, whose volume examines various aspects of the project of decolonization, our proposal is for creating and illuminating pluriversal and interversal paths that disturb the totality from which the universal and the global are most often perceived. And as Catherine Moore says, decoloniality seeks to make visible, open up and advance radically different perspectives and positionalities. We observe a similar drive in identity politics towards different positionalities and towards praxis. And there's a lot of work being done here to valorize lived experience within a plural set of interactions. And if we turn to psychology, informed by Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development, we see that decentering also known as decentration, refers to the ability to consider multiple aspects of a situation. And if we turn to organizational modeling, we find that according to the Encyclopedia of Governance, to decenter is to analyze knowledge and practices as fragmented and complex products of individual activity. So decentered theory rejects the notion that there's a single natural or incontestable reading of a text, institution, or series of events. And of course, we're familiar with the kind of proliferation and pluralizing that digital culture has facilitated, along with its bubble effects of fierce affiliation and contestation, and its confirmation biases that we associate with social media. So I mentioned postmodernism initially as a point of reference for this wider project of decentering, but I think the latter, particularly the social media context, cues us to arguably a different postmodern paradigm, which is not the endless relativizing of postmodernism, but is rather about cause, centers, specialisms, we might say in a conservatoire, specialist craft areas, and individual identities in an interconnected, pluralized realm. So what does that mean for a conservatoire like Guildhall? So to return to the three initiatives now that I've tried to unpack briefly here, the Theatre Green Book pilot, the Array Digital Archive exploration, the D-Centre as a vehicle for inquiry. They're all quite different, but I suggest that they operate modally across these key registers. The first is preservation, whilst drawing on and promoting new practices. The second is intersection, drawing lines between sectors, practices, constituencies. And then an idea of legacy, which is geared around continuities, that which must be preserved, we think, and disruption, that which surely now has to be altered. This is arguably different from a conventional view of a conservatoire as a place that sustains tradition and undertakes high-level training for a performance industry that has highly stratified standards and practices. Bruguière et al. Described this version of the conservatoire. As the name suggests, it's derived from the Latin conservare, to preserve. They tend to be conservative institutions, defenders of proud and rich traditions, to be sure, but also liable to be suspicious of and resistant to change. And then there's an example here from the Leeds Conservatory's website, Leeds in the north of England, providing a current perspective. What is a conservatoire? It's a specialist institution that trains students in music and performing arts, often with a practical focus with professional tuition and bespoke facilities and industry focused. And who could disagree with that? Meanwhile, the conservatoire in many iterations has become rather more than this. It's invested in ideas of public good and public benefit. That's certainly a part of Guildhall's strategy, and we see it elsewhere. It's fundamentally, by definition, intertwined now with the academy. Our programs, of course, are assured by, in the UK, the Office for Students, and we operate within validation frameworks and so forth, but also fundamentally intertwined with industries across the performing arts and the entertainment arts sectors. Plural forms of research, including practice-based research, are now a feature of what most conservatoires do. And developments in pedagogy, for example, in decolonizing the curriculum, developing student-led and student-centered learning, paying attention to transferable skills, have shifted our understanding of what it means to be educated now in a conservatoire. So I'd like to think of whether we can think of this collation as a newly concretizing discursive formation. So I hope you allow a brief turn to Foucault. In The Archaeology of Knowledge, Foucault says, whenever between objects, types of statement, concepts, or thematic choices, one can define a regularity, we will say for the sake of convenience that we're dealing with a discursive formation. And Foucault addresses the set of conditions in accordance with which a practice is exercised. An attempt to reveal discursive practices in their complexity and their density, and to show that to speak is to do something other than to express what one thinks. In other words, the how we think, how we do things, exists within this continuum. It's a discursive field that's also a field of practice, which contains instances of praxis. And this depicts a domain of knowledge that some scholars would call an epistemic scenario, concerning, as it does, how meaning plays out in the fields in which we work. And of course, there are underlying assumptions and processes that we might think of as ideological, along with unintended biases, but these are all expressed in practices that are designed, embodied, and enacted. So in the three instances that I've rather randomly, perhaps, brought together here, I'd like to suggest that we can consider the discursive field that they sit within and think of them together. They all involve systems within systems, multiple elements that are monofocal, specific skill sets, specific technological applications, concentrated zones of craft. They are both linear in their workflow and non-linear. They involve single authors and single skilled practitioners and, crucially, teams of people. They involve, in our pedagogic context, students as interactors and co-creators rather than as learners in a top-down model. And they will have a single or overarching aim, but very plural applications. And it's this collation of characteristics that I suggest helps to define this as a discursive field that's a post-postmodern field. Its elements are purposive. It's a field that has centers in a decentered or a highly matrix-like model. And I should have brought that slide up to illustrate that, but there we are. And I'd like lastly to wonder, and again, this is just a passing glance, whether complexity theory helps us here, and I suggest it not as a really as a value judgment. It's not that complexity necessarily equals good, but whether this helps to articulate a kind of technical feature of this landscape. So as Park suggests in a potted summary, complexity theory can be understood generally as the study of complex adaptive systems. The word complex implies diversity through a great number and a wide variety of independent yet autonomous parts. Adaptive refers to the system's ability to change, and the system portion refers to a set of connected and interdependent parts, indeed a network. We understand diversity now, of course, in terms of equity and inclusion, but here it means a great number and a wide variety of independent and yet autonomous parts. And this seems important to the work that I've tried to address in this particular conservatoire. We're interested in a cultural ecosystem that's dynamic and shifting and that's always interrelational, where we're not only training students for industry, but intersecting with industry in a common aim of development and adaptation. So, lastly, then our pedagogy is development-oriented rather than solely to do with knowledge transmission in a more orthodox model, although that has a place. We are not nostalgic, we hope, in clinging to the past, but we respect the past in order to nurture what we have, and this in itself is an act of continual, deliberate production. And the model here is not top-down, telling people what to do, but it's lateral and plurivocal in its relationships, activities, and modalities. So can we therefore talk of the complex conservatoire? And again, I'm cautious of suggesting this in a grandiloquent way, but wondering whether now for the conservatoire as an institution invested in, at one level, training for industry, it's now much more interesting to think that we can extend scope and actually be much more porous. And that porosity is also about changing the institution in and of itself at this point where these institutions have been under proper and significant challenge. So the complex conservatoire is this necessarily intersecting, interconnected set of discrete activities where ideas of excellence are factored alongside an acknowledgement of insufficiency, requirement, and interdependency. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy, for such an engaging and genuinely thought-provoking presentation. Before I open up the floor, for questions, it's very interesting how the discourse on sustainability, which was initially conceived, within the United Nations and with the Sustainability Development Goals, and later on picked up by green parties and to some extent even pressure groups, and now it's catching up with us. And since we're talking about pedagogy, I sat on some accreditation committees, and for a university to be well ranked, it has to have good scores on sustainability. Is the campus sustainable? Is it diverse? Is it international? So a university may be losing points because it could not really meet those kind of requirements. It's very interesting how, through your presentation now, we're talking about eco-signography, eco-dramaturgy, and every time I think about theater history, I think theater history is a good case of counter-history. It does go against the westward march of Hegel, and let us remember that theater, since it was even institutionalized 500 years before Common Era, was actually environmental, and it was eco-friendly. We just think about the Agora, and of course about the Theater of Dionysus, and how Theater of Dionysus could have, a litany of plays, dithyrambs, and of course tragedies, and all the rest of it during the whole day. So I just think that theater is going to be resilient, no matter what digital changes are going to be there. And I'd like to end up with a statement that I learned from Gayatri Spivak, who's based at Columbia University, and she has an interesting concept called affirmative sabotage. You have to kind of retool whatever comes with globalization. So I'll open, of course, the floor for questions. We have exactly 15 minutes. And the way I'm going to do it, I'm going to take 3 questions, or we are going to take 3 questions. And of course, if we have time enough, we can open up for another round. 3 questions.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. I hope to share the links with my own department, where we have 1,500 students doing theater all the time. So my question is, how is this idea of conservation, if you will, incorporated into your pedagogy, into the courses that you offer? You gave us one example of a more or less a very recent production, but is that just a one-off, or is this systematically incorporated into everything you do?
Thank you. Second question, perhaps? Okay, so we'll take that question then.
Thank you. Is this on?
No, I have to switch off. Yeah.
The green light's gone on. It must be on. Thank you, Carol. Well, that was a pilot production. We're doing 2 pilot productions this academic year, and the aim is for all productions the following academic year to be according to Theatre Green Book standard. So that folds it into production practice, which is the main vehicle for students learning, certainly those undergraduate students. And then as part of that, from their first year inductions, they're inducted into principles of sustainability and some of the specific features of the Green Book protocols. But those protocols then work through the production process, as I touched on very briefly. This does sit within the wider context of Guildhall School's sustainability position, if you like. I mean, you wouldn't know this necessarily, but the school is a part of the City of London Corporation, and the corporation runs the financial district and the Barbican Arts Centre and various other institutions, and has its own sustainability plan that applies to all of those institutions. So comes to what you were saying at the beginning, I think, that the presence of programs, targets, the kind of administration of this work is actually a key feature of it continuing to be progressed.
We have a second question. Your name, please, and your affiliation, if any.
Hello, Thorsten Joost is my name. I'm from Berlin, Free University Berlin. That's the affiliation. And my question comes from Berlin in a way because looking at, German Regie theater and theater, it can be incredibly wasteful. For example, Florentina Holzinger is the latest craze of last season, and she had like multiple swimming pools on stage built for this performance, and it was tons of paper and slime and artificial blood used in this performance. It cost thousands and thousands of euros. And I was watching it and was, knowing about the Green Book development, and was thinking, wow, I wonder, how all these directors who in our performance and theater culture, how will they deal with these developments? How will they change their aesthetics and their styles of directing? And I wonder, of this, how is the aesthetics changing and responding to these Green Book developments? And if there is feedback, you were talking about the institutional things and dimensions of this, but I saw the Deutsches Theater is on your list, and the Staatsschauspiel Dresden, which are 2 German cities and state municipal theaters doing this. So maybe you have some feedback from these institutions, how German Regie Theater is dealing with these Green Book regular principles.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I don't know specifically, and it feels to me that it's early days. The National Theatre in the UK has been doing a lot of leadership work in this area too. I mean, I think what's already clear is that programming choices are significant. Some plays or envisaged productions of some plays are likely to have a bigger sustainability challenge than others. So that's the first thing. But then there's the question about the design decisions that you make and how you configure a sustainable practice, partly against the various increments that are detailed in the Theatre Green Book. So it will change production practice. And I think this makes me think of I think it was something in the question that Richard was asking Marvin, where, I kind of understood it to mean that by implication, things that are exciting and experimental and extraordinary and seem to be progressive at one moment, 30 years later, 50 years later, that's not the case because they've been superseded by some other paradigm. And that might be the case in what you're describing, that there's a very spectacular, lavish, excessive form of production that to audiences, not least to producers and people who run venues, will seem distasteful, arguably. So perhaps that's a paradigm that we're moving towards.
I think we have a third question here.
السلام عليكم. عبد الكريم الشباكي، كلية علوم التربية الرباط. أنا أريد أن أستفيد من تجربتكم لا سيما على مستوى بدائل تدريس فنون الأداء في المؤسسات الجامعية. من التحديات التي نعيشها هو التدريس الشطر الأكبر داخل الفصول الدراسية داخل القسم، والأولى أن نخصص الشطر الأكبر لتدريس فنون الأداء في الفضاءات العمومية. الفضاءات العمومية يمكن أن توفر حظوظاً أكبر للاستثمار في التربية الجمالية لفنون الأداء. ما هي من خلال تجربتكم البدائل والشروط لإنضاج هذه الفكرة حتى نوطنها في المؤسسات والجامعات المغربية؟ شكراً لكم.
Supposed to translate. The gentleman there is asking how we could possibly in Morocco learn from these alternative pedagogies, and how could we possibly put such a vision in programs, educational programs, and interest younger generation in such alternative approaches and strategies.
Well, thank you for the question. I feel in large part it would actually be presumptuous of me to say, and I feel that it would also be proper for me to say that, and this was a theme of the previous keynote as well, that we should at least equally be learning from theatre cultures and theatre practice here and indeed other parts of the world. I think to properly answer the question would require me to have a better knowledge of the sorts of program or training that is already being delivered and the pedagogic models that obtain. But I think certainly in the UK over the last 10 years, I would say, we've seen a move towards a different set of choices about texts, wider representation of different kinds of lived experience, an attempt to pluralize the involvement of artists from industry, and also, whilst on the one hand that's a professional training for industry that depends upon some established workflows, also the growth and development of student-centered creative practice. where the student has agency in developing the work that then gets produced on stage. And of course, this is a wider development in theatre practice over a longer period, but I think in a conservatoire context, that's now becoming significant.
Time for an additional question, if any? Yes.
Okay. Good morning. Before I ask my question, I would like to start with the quote from Walter D. Mignolo's book, Local Histories, Global Designs. Quote, geopolitics of knowledge goes hand in hand with geopolitics of knowing. Who and when, why and where is knowledge generated rather than produced, like cars or cell phones? Asking these questions means to shift the attention from the enunciated to the enunciation, and by so doing, turning Descartes dictum inside out, rather than assuming that thinking comes before being.
The question, please, Sinaim, the question, because we don't have time.
Okay. So my question is, in the age of AI, agents, so what's your idea of theater, as long as we are living in an age where we are no more the only agents that circulate and vehicle theatrical knowledge? And thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and also thank you for pointing us back into that work by Mignolo as well. I mean, I think I might understand there that we are interested in textures of thought and expression as much as the thing that's said. So how the thing is said and the relations that it then envisages, which, you know, of course, one would want to say should be equitable and respectful and pluralistic. In terms of the incursion of AI and the kind of theatre that might move us towards, one of the things I've wanted to argue for is, dare one say, the centrality of human agency and creative responsibility in this more hybrid, hyper-mediated context. So one of the, and I think it's too early to know what AI will do. It will, you know, punish us, it will contain us, and it will also liberate us. You know, what's the balance? I don't think we know. But it seems to me that it's for human agents to determine how AI is productive for us, and then how that might feed into a theatre practice. I mean, I can certainly understand it, again, in line with Richard's question, that a translation function for AI would be extraordinary for theatre practitioners, to be able more easily to access, you know, not just texts, but representations, presentations, vernacular performances from around the world would be an extraordinary step forward in our knowledge base. So that would be an optimistic view.
Well, every good thing comes to an end. Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. I just had this kind of final sort of thought. Are you now speaking about green Regibooks? Prompt books? A Regibook is le cahier de régisseur in French, you know.
Well, that's a good question, I don't know, but I think we probably should.
It's a German word, but
yeah, I think we probably should.
Well, we can work on it. Thank you. Well, let's give Andy a warm applause.
Thank you very much.
ندير النسخة الأخيرة. شوف متأكد.
يلا اوكي، انا كنت بقرا من هني ولكن الحمد لله عندي هني.
شوف ندير النسخة الأخيرة.
بس هذا ها.
أو هذا أو هذا.
خلاص
مهم هذا اللي سهلين.
احد راح يأشر لي على الوقت ولا في ساعدني على الوقت؟
بينك وبين
المشكلة يعني
رئيس الجلسة.
أنا رئيس الجلسة.
إذن
خلاص بعطي حق نفس الوقت هاي كذي أرجع ورا ها. اوكي بس هذا كان المفروض يصير صفحة واحدة بس يلا عادي عادي. هذا انطر عليه كذي ولا ما فيه؟ يعني صفحة فاضية؟
بوغ انيماسيون على حسب الانيماسيون داكشي علاش خرجت هذا خاوي باش تبدا ندير. عاود نفس الشيء كاين هنايا سلايد من هنا.
مقروء كذي. ما تتكبر الشاشة هذه؟
انا نجربها.
From the beginning, okay, I'll go. عليكم السلام.
جاهز.
تقدر تعطيهم هناك هم يتولون القصة.
هذا بس للكمبيوتر، أنا حجيب كمبيوتر تبعهم.
You can give them the USB and they will arrange it.
Just in case.
Yeah.
وهو مع الهاو.
Yeah. First I will give my presentation, بعدين I will invite you all.
بالترتيب.
لا كلكم راحتين.
اوكي.
كونكتي.
شو محيد. خليه هنا يحسن جاب الله. Or not. هذا باين.
ولكن الكابل ماشي
عندك هنا كاب احسن منه.
انا غنجيب لك اخر. عطيني هذه باش ناخذ بها اليو اس بي. هذه شي وحده اللي كنستعملها.
لك اقعد استاذي.
أو شيء تحت. بعدين I will finish my paper. I will invite you all. Okay. You will change the computer later?
فين عملتها؟ واحدة من هذه.
Where's my presentation? Because I will read from. صباح الخير جميعا. بداية يعني لا أجد مفر من البداية التقليدية وتوجيه الشكر الجزيل للدكتور خالد أمين على هذا الجهد الكبير على المستوى الإداري والعلمي والإنساني، ويمد جسور التعاون بين مختلف المبدعين في العالم والوطن العربي، فله كل التحية والامتنان، وكذلك شكر موصول إلى الجهات المنظمة والمشتغلة بالمهرجان، فلهم جزيل الشكر. يعني واقع الحال يعني لن أستغل سلطة رئيس الجلسة في مد وقت إضافي وسألتزم بالوقت، ولكن سوف أستغله أكون أول المحاضرين. لذلك سوف ألقى ملخص البحث عن توثيق نص الفرجة المسرحية بين الهجنة والتعليم، وأخذ مسرح سليمان البسام نموذجاً. كان المسرح دائما ولا يزال يتسم بتداخل الثقافات، ولا تعد عروض تداخل الثقافات شيئا جديدا، على الرغم من أنها ممارستها الواعية والواسعة الانتشار قد بدأت فقط في القرن العشرين، كما بدأ وضع نظريات لها في الأكاديميات الغربية من خلال السبعينيات والثمانينيات من القرن الماضي وما بعدها، خاصة أنه تعد مرحلة دراسة الفنون في المعاهد والكليات الفنية على حسب أنواعها هي حجر الزاوية في المجال العلمي والتطبيقي، حيث تعد الفترة التي يتم فيها وضع البذور الأولى لشخصية الفنان أو المصمم وبلورتها وبزوغ ملامحها في مستقبله الفني. المحور الأول: المعايير الأكاديمية في الفنون المسرحية. تنبثق المعايير الأكاديمية لدراسة الفنون المسرحية من الهدف العام لها، وهو التعلم والمتعة في آن واحد. فهدف المسرح منذ نشأته هو التعليم، كما أنه فن جماهيري تعبيري بالدرجة الأولى، مما قد يتطلب العديد من العمليات العلمية المعاصرة للنهوض به، والبحث عن أسلوب فني جديد معبر عن روح العصر ليس بالشيء السهل إلا إذا أدرك الفنان مفردات عصره ووعى لها، وغالبا ما يأتي الأسلوب المناسب لذلك بعد الكثير من الجهد والتجربة، كما في تجربة البسام المسرحية. نظرية الهجين. التجريب المسرحي منح الانفتاح على أفق التصورات المختلفة في رؤية الأداء ومنظور الرؤية الحداثية، حيث فتح الإبداع شكلا من أشكال الهجنة. إن غزو التقنيات داخل العرض المسرحي يولد تساؤلات أساسية تتعلق بعلاقة المسرح وارتباطه بما يحيط به. التلاقي بين مجموعة من الإمكانيات الحديثة المتوفرة للمسرح وإبداعات مؤلفيه وممثليه ومخرجيه يؤدي بالقطع إلى تعقيد طرق تناول العرض بين المسرح والتقنيات الحديثة تتواجد عند أشكال مسرحية جديدة مهجنة، خاصة في تجربة الفرجة لدى سليمان البسام، وتحرض المخزون المعرفي والثقافي لدى المتفرج على الإفصاح عن نفسه بما يوسع المجال الدلالي للعرض المسرحي خاصة، وأن مركزية المتلقي تمنح بعداً مركزياً في تأثيث النص وصناعة الفرجة الأدائية حسب متطلباته في الخطاب والتواصل وانشغالاته الفكرية نحو واقعه. لا يكتفي المسرح بتقديم كياناته وتجاربه للقراءة معزولة عن المشاهدة، ذلك أننا حين نتحدث عن تجارب روتوفسكي المعملية أو منشكين أو باربرا وغيرهم، فإننا نتحدث عن عمل منجز كما في حالة سليمان البسام. فالبحث يهتم على وجه الخصوص بتجارب البسام التي استطاعت أن تؤسس لظاهرة جديدة تتمثل في الانفتاح على إيقاع الحداثة وما بعد الحداثة وما بعد الدراما، في محاولة للقبض على راهنية الوعي الجمالي بالمعاصرة. تمثل سمات ومكونات المسرح المضاد والمعاصر وما بعد الدراما. لذلك ننطلق من فرضية مفادة أن الخروج من عصر التنظير إلى واقع الممارسة الفعلية يفضي بالضرورة إلى التحرر من القوقعة والانفلات إلى آفاق الكونية، وهو افتراض لا يتعزز إلا من خلال قناعة مفادها أن الإبداع أي إبداع لا ينمو في التربة المحلية، وإنما من خلال ما سماه ديلوز بالمغادرة الوطنية، بمعنى الانقلاع من التربة المحلية والانغراس في أتربة أخرى، وكذلك البحث عن صيغ فنية وقوالب إبداعية. وقد أصبح من الضروري أن يقوم المسرح بدوره في تقريب الثقافات والحضارات المتباينة، حيث يعد المسرح شكلاً ثقافياً يرفض الانزواء والعزلة وينفي الاستتباع، بل يدعم المسرح إلى مقولة المشترك الإنساني والتلاقي والتلاحم من منظور الانفتاح الخلاق والمثمر على الحضارات والثقافات الأخرى، حيث نهدف من خلال هذه القراءة إلى دراسة معالجة البسام لنموذج مسرحي من التراث الإنساني العالمي، بوصفها نماذج للخطاب التعددي والذي يتشكل منه الفضاء الثالث الهجين. وهذا ما يطرح التساؤلات: كيف تتجلى أوجه الهجنة الثقافية في مسرح البسام؟ هل كانت قراءة البسام للنص قراءة منتجة استطاع من خلالها تقديم ترجمة ثقافية لهذا التراث الإنساني العالمي؟ وبعبارة أخرى، هل استطاع تحقيق قراءة كونية للنص؟ وما أثر الاستراتيجيات التناصية التهجنية التي اتبعها من أجل تجاوز سلطة النص. لذلك تسعى الدراسة إلى تأمل حركة تطور المسرح ودفعه لارتياد آفاق مغايرة في ظل أجهزتها المفاهيمية مثل المثاقفة والتهجين والتناسج الثقافي في تجربة البسام. واستندت هذه الدراسة إلى أدوات النقد الثقافي باعتباره المنظور الفكري للدراسة، ويعد أحد الركائز المهمة والرئيسية لكونه يشكل الإطار المرجعي وموجه للباحث والمبحوث أيضاً. وتعد الهجنة هي المفهوم الأكثر شهرة عند هومي بابا، حيث ينظر هومي إلى الهجنة بوصفها نظرية المزيج الثقافي التي تسعى إلى مقارعة فكرة أحادية الثقافة. وقد صاغ بابا مفهوم الهجنة في كتابه موقع الثقافة ليؤكد أن لحظة التفاعل والتبادل بين الثقافات المختلفة هي محصلة لحظة الهجنة، أو ما يدعوه بابا بالفضاء الثالث، بوصفه فضاء يصعب معالجته بالقدر نفسه الذي يصعب فيه اختزاله في مجرد انصهار كيانين. وبين تبني الشكل الغربي والانصهار الكامل داخله، كان من الضروري إمعان النظر في مفهوم الفضاء الثالث، فضاء الهجنة، الذي يستشرف ممارسات مسرحية من خلال تناسج ثقافات الأنا والآخر لابتكار أشكال مغايرة وطرح أسئلة جديدة تتأسس على منهجية توافقية تقر بضرورة التوفيق بين الموروث الفرجوي للأنا والمنجز المسرحي الغربي للآخر. وبذلك تصبح الهجنة ضد فلسفة النقاء، فلا وجود للجوهرانية أو الماهوية ما دامت هناك بناءات ثقافية دائما مسافرة كسفر ورحلة البسام نحو مسرح الآخر ومسرحته. حسب فيتشر يمكن الجوهر مفهوم الفرجوية الأدائية في المفهوم الجسدي بين المؤدين والجمهور كشرط مسبق لإنجاز فرجة. وحينما تتشدد فيتشر على البعد الاجتماعي لقاء المسرحي، فذلك لكونها تريد إبراز دور المتفرج في تحقيق الفرجة من حيث هي حدث استثنائي، فالتفاعل المتساوي بين الفاعلين يصبح علامة كل الأحداث الفرجوية. تنجز الفرجة داخله من خلال الحضور الجسدي لكل من الممثلين والجمهور. إنه لا يمكن الحديث عن تفكيك مركزية الدراسات المسرحية الأوروبية إلا إذا تجاوزت الخطاب المتعالي. وهنا يثار تساؤل في غاية الأهمية: ما السبيل إلى استرجاع التاريخ المنسي لبعض الثقافات الفرجوية التي غيبت تغيبا ممنهجا؟ هل لا تزال هناك فجوة بين الشرق والغرب فيما يختص بالممارسة المسرحية؟ هل هناك حدود فاصلة بين ما يشكل المسرح الغربي الخالص مقابل التقاليد المسرحية الخاصة ببقية الشعوب والثقافات؟ هل يحق لنا الآن أن ننكر أسامات المسرح الغربي في تطوير منجزنا المسرحي؟ هل المقصود هو التخلي عن أوروبا والابتعاد عنها إلى الأبد؟ أليس هذا وهما ما دامت أوروبا تقيم في كياننا؟ هل توجد إمكانية الانفصال عن هذا الغرب؟ هل المقصود هو التخلي عن المسرح في صيغته الغربية بعد أن تجذر في مخيلتنا الفرجوي وأصبح جزء من تراثنا؟ هل المسرح الغربي واحدا ومنسجم ومتجانس؟ يحق لنا أن نرفض الإسهامات القيمة لمسارح العالم لا لشيء إلا لإبراز خصوصياتنا المحلية؟ ألا يتعين علينا أن نتساءل: هل نمتلك فعلا نظرية مسرحية خاصة بنا وغير متفاعلة مع نظريات أخرى سابقة؟ نظرية مدركة لتاريخها الخاص، مستوعبة لأسئلة زمنها وسياقها التاريخي هنا والآن. نحن أمام طرائق واجتهادات محمودة ومنظومات من المعارف والرؤى تتراوح بين الأنا والآخر. ثقافات الفرجة نحو تفكيك مركزية المثاقفة المركزية الغربية. إن مسرح المثاقفة هو أكبر وأكثر جنس فني، لأنه ينطوي على بنية تفكير تجمع بين رأس المال العام الأول وتفوقه في المادة الخام وعمالة بقية العالم، ويتم في الغالب اعتماد النصوص المسرحية الغربية الخالدة ولكن بأساليب أدائية فرجوية شرقية، أو يتم اختزال ملاحم وأعمال خالدة وإفراغها من محتوياتها لتقديمها كوصفات جاهزة لجمهور غربي متعطش لكل ما هو غريب. تثير حالات المثاقفة إشكالات عديدة، منها من قبيل هيمنة النموذج الغربي على آخره والتبعية الثقافية بين الشمال والجنوب. مسرحية إيميديا لسليمان البسام لا تعد عروض تداخل الثقافات شيئا جديدا، على الرغم من أن ممارستها الواسعة الانتشار قد بدأت فقط في القرن العشرين، كما بدأ وضع نظريات لها في الأكاديميات الغربية خلال السبعينيات والثمانينيات من القرن الماضي وما بعده. وسليمان البسام في عمله أي ميديا النائمة في بطن التراجيديا، الآثار التراجيدية مع يوربيديوس، من الممكن أن تكون شرارة مسرحية عبرها يتكون السؤال عن وضع ما هو الكولونيالي من جهة المهاجر الذي تعاد منه كتابة التاريخ، تاريخ الحداثة. إن هذه المرأة القوقازية القادمة من كوليشش، القادمة من وراء البحار غير الشرعية في نثيا، هي تلك العلامة الجذرية على الإنسان المنبوذ في أرض ليست وطنا، فقرر الانتقام وتشعيل النار. ولهذا فهي مؤهلة للاستدعاء من جديد على الركح المسرحي بربطه تدمير النص الأصلي الذي امتلكه يوربيديوس وإعادة توجيهه على نحو تنتهي فيه تفاوته ويعمل فيه ذلك السؤال. ذلك يدعونا البسام منذ بداية عرضه على أي ميديا إلى رمي الأسطورة الأصلية عرض الحائط، مؤكدا أنه باستعادتها سيقول شيئا ما غير الذي قيل سابقا. نعم، يوحى لنا صاحب هذا العمل أنه يتعكز على نص تراجيدي غابر قصد تصريف عرضه المسرحي، ولكنه في الحقيقة يستدرجنا إلى السكن في فضاء بيني متداخل أشبه بمنطقة القلق والهجنة والانشطار. يجب يجيب البسام على فيض من الأسئلة نحو ميديا وعن ميديا. هل ستلعب ميديا في هذا العرض نفس الدور القديم بوصفها مغدورة في حبها، أم أنها ستقذف في قول جديد ووضعيات مغايرة؟ ما الذي يحدث في كورنثيا الجديدة فيعيدنا إلى استحضار ميديا يوربيديوس؟ وهل وجود ميديا الحالي مع سليمان البسام إحالة جذرية على انتقام المرأة، أم أن مربعا مغايرا من شأنه تدمير الفضاء السياسي لكورنثيا الجديدة؟ هل يعد عرض أي ميديا ضربا من كتابة المحو على إنقاذ كتابات أخرى سابقة مثلما هو الحال في مسرح ما بعد الدراما؟ هل يعد سؤالا عن مقدار الدقة التي من خلالها نعرف الماضي أمام حول ما يجري الآن في الحاضر؟ نحن أمام عمل خضع لسلسلة من الإجراءات والتداريب ضمن فلسفة ومنظور جماليين نحو توحيد كيانات الفرجة وأطرافها في إطار علاقة تشاركية منتجة تجعل من المسرح واقعة سوسيولوجية وتجربة عاطفية وفكرية بكل المقاييس. يحيل عالم المسرح بتجاربه إلى أطر معرفية مختلفة، منها ما هو تقني تجريبي ينجز في مختبرات ومعاهد وأماكن تحضير العروض، ويحيل إلى فلسفات جمالية وتصورات ومنظورات فكرية وأيديولوجية كما حدث مع البسام. وعلى هذا النحو من التساؤل المسرحي كان سليمان البسام يجر ميديا يوربيديوس إلى عرضه المسرحي بقصد تدميرها، تدمير نقاوة النص الأصلي وإعادة مسرحته، كما لا يمكن إطلاق النظر إلى النص المنتج النصي الجديد للعرض على أنه نص نقي هو الآخر، أنه حصيلة مفعول الهجنة، أين تستقر ثقافتين متنافرتين على نفس الحد في كورنثيا. إنما هي السؤال دون الجدوى من إحياء ميديا مجددا هو ما تمتلكه من طاقة رمزية هائلة في التعبير عن جحيم الراهن. ولذلك فإن عملية تقطيع أوصالها ما هي إلا حدث جمالي يرسم الاستشكال الراهن على ضوء مصاحبة التاريخ المتكرر. في وقت نقرأ النتائج في دقيقة واحدة، اسمحوا لي بس. الرؤية الفنية للمسرح تتبع منهج أكاديمي يتابع تغيرات على مستوى النظريات الجمالية وأفق التحديث والوعي الثقافي ودوافع التلقي الناجح. الدراسة العلمية للعوالم الجديدة حول العالم تتيح إعادة النظر في الفرجة كأبعاد أيديولوجية وأفق تنظيري جديد. التعلم المسرحي يحيل النطاق الأوسع لمستوى الفرجة وتمثيل الجانب الواعي للمتغيرات وأثرها على مستوى الأداء والأشكال السينغرافية. التساؤل وصناعة منطق فني جمالي يفتح حدود الخطاب المغلق وينفتح على تصورات جديدة بين محوري المنتج والمتلقي. العامل البيني يؤثر في تداخل التفاعل بين العلوم لصناعة مسرح جديد، إعادة قراءة التراث وبعثه في صور تكنولوجيا تراعي الجانب الحداثي، ومحاولة الحفاظ على المحلية والهواتية بين إشكالية العزل وتطور تجاذب الرؤية في صناعة العرض، وبناء الفرجة بين البعد المركب، ومحاولة تأسيس منظومة فنية تكتسي الجغرافيا الثقافية للإنتاج الفني. تجربة آي ميديا لسليمان البسام إعادة فهم تراجيديا وتلبيس التصورات الجديدة في صراع جمالي فكريا وثقافيا وفرجويا، إعادة النظر في المساءلة البيداغوجية للمسرح وسط هالة التغير الكوني والتكنولوجي، وهي تماثلات لا تعيش بعزلة عن المسرح بل تتنامى في رحم وجوديته بين التعلم والهجنة والفرجة. لا يمكن الحديث عن تفكيك مركزية الدراسات المسرحية الأوروبية إلا إذا تجاوزت الخطاب المتعالي وعادت إلى دائرة الرشد وأقرت بتعدديتها القابلة للاختزال وبتفاعلها التاريخي مع الثقافات الأخرى. أكتفي لهذا الحد مراعاة للوقت وأترك المجال لزملائي. I will leave the time for the participant and I will invite them to take the stage. I will invite the conference participant to take the stage, please. بداية سوف نذهب إلى أول محاضرين، الدكتور عبد المجيد الهواس، أستاذ السينوغرافيا بالمعهد العالي للفن المسرحي والتنشيط الثقافي، وورقة بعنوان السينوغرافيا وتجليات الفضاء المسرحي. كل التوفيق أستاذ عبد المجيد.
في البدء أود أن أشكر المركز الدولي لدراسات الفرجة في شخص الدكتور خالد أمين على دعوته الكريمة، مثلما أشكر اللجنة المنظمة وجميع الحضور الكريم. تروم هذه الورقة تجاوز الحديث عن الخطاب المتداول حول السينوغرافيا، والذي يربط منجزها أساساً بالعمل الفني الذي يتم عرضه على الخشبة، فقد ألفنا استبعاد علاقتها الوطيدة بمجالات متعددة أهمها هندسة الفضاء المسرحي ومعماره. أكيد أن التجارب المسرحية المغربية اجتازت أشواطاً هامة في تثبيت مكانة العمل السينوغرافي داخل الفرجة المسرحية. ساهم في ذلك بشكل كبير التكوين الذي يتلقاه طلبة المعهد العالي للفن المسرحي والتنشيط الثقافي بالرباط، مثلما ساهمت مرونة التكوين بشعبة السينوغرافيا في بروز أسماء عديدة راكمت الخبرات وتجاوزت النظرة التقليدية التي تربط المسرح بمفهوم الإيهام، وتربط السينوغرافيا بصناعة الديكور وتأثيث الخشبة، ساعية نحو منح الزي والضوء والصوت قيمة دراماتورجية أكبر، وهي الآن توسع من آفاقها عبر الاستثمار في تعدد الوسائط بما في ذلك الوسائط الرقمية. غير أن حقيقة التطور الذي قد يعرفه المسرح المغربي ليس رهينا بتحسن الجوانب الفنية أو التقنية أو تعدد القاعات، فالسينوغرافيا تبرز داخل العمل المسرحي بأوجه متعددة. أولها يتجلى في تحديد طبيعة فضاء الإرسال والتلقي الخاص بكل تجربة، ثم وفق الخيارات المعتمدة العلبة أم الدائرة، الفضاء المنغلق أم الهواء الطلق، حيث أن التنظيم المعتمد يشكل هيكلاً وبنية لفضاء سيكون الوعاء الرحم الذي تولد من داخله الأعمال الفنية. لقد سبق لشارل غارنيه أن تحدث عن كون الإنسان يشعر بأن تشييد بناية هو المكمل الضروري للإنتاج الأدبي والركحي، مكان يحتوي الفاعلين والجمهور في آن واحد بالشكل الذي يجعل الإحساس بما هو درامي يجاور الإحساس بما هو معمار، فلا يمكن مطلقا عزل هذين الإحساسين عن بعضهما، وذلك نظرا للتأثير المتبادل بين شكل البناية وطبيعة الدراماتورجيا التي يمكن أن تصاغ داخلها، مثلما أكد بيير سونغيل على هذا الالتحام، إذ أن شكل القصيدة وشكل البناية يؤثر أحدهما في الآخر، حيث تفرض القاعة سلطتها شئنا ذلك أم أبينا، أسلوبها، حدودها، هندستها الصوتية إلى آخره. جاكوبو كان يعتبر بأن شكل القصيدة وإن كان في الأصل هو من أفرز شكل المسرح، فإن هذا الشكل حين صار مكتملا صار هو من يتحكم في الجماليات التي تؤطر خيال الشاعر. بمعنى ما فإن شكل الفضاء هو الذي يؤطر شكل الكتابة، ومن ثم تكمن سلطته، ولعل ذلك هو الشيء الذي مكن أسخيلوس من إيجاد صيغ جديدة للعب وللتأليف المسرحي عبر حياكة اللعب بين الداخل والخارج، تنظيم إيقاعي يلاعب خيال المتلقي بين ما يراه وما يتجلى له، فاللامرئي هو الذي يشهد الخيال، أي كل ما يحجبه المعمار وكل ما يوحي به في نفس الوقت. يقول محمد الكغاط في كتابه عن المسرح وفضاءاته إن المسارح تحاول دائما أن تلائم نوع المسرحيات التي كتبت في العصر الذي بنيت فيه، فهناك مثلا ملائمة تامة بين المسرح الإليزابيثي والمسرحيات التي كتبت في ذلك العصر، ولا نتصور كاتبا يؤلف نصا مسرحيا وذهنه خال تماما من نوع الخشبة التي سيعرض عليها ذلك النص. وعندما تعرض مسرحيات قديمة في قاعات معاصرة البناء أو العكس، فإن النص والإخراج يحاولان التكيف مع قاعة العرض. تصمم المسارح عادة كأداة instrument قبل أن يتم اعتبارها معالم، بمعنى أن مؤهلاتها الفنية ومكوناتها التقنية تصب في اتجاه منح العمل الدراماتورجي إمكانيات ومنافذ تحفز المبدع على صياغة عمله والتجديد فيه، الأمر الذي يتيح إيجاد الحلول لتطوير أساليب الأداء وخلق إمكانيات التلاقي الفعلي مع الجمهور، غير أن ذلك لا يتأتى إلا عبر إيجاد فضاء يقدم احتمالات متعددة تمكن المبدعين الدراميين من إبداع أساليب جديدة في تناول الكتابة وفي البحث السينوغرافي وفي ممكنات الإخراج. لعل ذلك ما حفز مايرهول لأن ينتقد أولئك الذي يبدأون ببناء المسارح استنادا إلى فكرة المعماري بدل الاستناد إلى القائمين بشؤون المسرح وممارسيه. قد يكون الخلل بالنسبة للمسارح العربية يكمن في العقلية التي افترضت أن العلبة الإيطالية هي الحل النهائي للفضاء المسرحي، ولم تستفد بالقدر الممكن من الاجتهادات التي ألحت منذ بداية القرن العشرين على ضرورة العمل التصوري المبتكر الذي يتيح التفكير في الفضاء بإعادة تشكيله أملاً في تحقيق فرجة شاملة. فالمصلحون الكبار أبيا غريك أنطوان فاغنر لم يزعزعوا فقط، يقول ميشيل كورفان، العلاقة بين العرض المسرحي والنص، ولم يقودوا فقط إلى إعادة تقييم مختلف مكوناته، بل إنهم حثوا أيضا على التأمل الشامل حول الفرجوي وآثاره، فكانت إعادة النظر في البناية المسرحية وعلاقة الجمهور بالقاعة الأكثر بروزا من بين مجموع التغييرات التي أحدثوها. قدم أندري فوزان ورقة في مؤتمر رواية موند سنة 1961 تحدث فيها عن تجربته في مركز التكوين بالمعمورة، والذي استلهم من فضاءاته مقاربة سينوغرافية تخالف تماما مسرح العلبة الذي يتوافق مع الشكل الدرامي الغربي، ساعيا إلى اقتراح شكل معماري يوازي خصوصيات الثقافة المغربية. لقد توضح له أن فضاء المعمورة هو بناية غنية بما يكفي من موارد قابلة للتشكيل، طراسة، ساحة، نوافذ وشرفات، وتتيح إمكانية تنظيم اللعب داخل الفضاء، وهو فضاء يزاوج بين خاصية المسرح الإليزابيثي عبر شكله العمودي وبانورامية مسارح القرون الوسطى التي تتيح فضاءات متزامنة simultané. لقد شكل مجال اللعب منطقة وسطى بينهما، الشيء الذي كان يمنح القوة والسلطة الملهمة سواء للممثل أو للجمهور من خلال القدرات المستفزة لهذا المزيج من المعمار، مقارنة مع ما كان يحدث داخل العلبة الإيطالية كلما أقيمت فيها التداريب. لقد كانت الارتجالات التي يقيمها الممثلون ضعيفة النتائج. إن العلبة الإيطالية تمنح أينما كانت نفس علامات الإرهاق. لذلك وللحديث عن مشكلة المعمار المسرحي في إفريقيا كان من اللازم البحث عن صياغة أكثر انشراحا وأكثر ملائمة لحالة الطقس والحاجات. غير أن مشروعه لم يكتمل بعد أن تم رسميا تبني مسرح العلبة، وهو بالنسبة لفوازان استنساخ سيء للأشكال التي تآكلت وانتهت صلاحيتها بالنسبة للأوروبيين أنفسهم. وهذا ربما ما دفع الطيب صديقي لأن يقول: نحتاج إلى المسرح الذي يعبر عن شخصيتنا دونما قواعد أو أطر مسقطة إسقاطا. نحتاج إلى المسرح العربي الذي في الشوارع والساحات والأسواق. من قال إن المتفرج العربي يريد أن يجلس لمدة ساعتين في قاعة مغلقة؟ ومن قال أنه يريد مسرحا شتويا يبدأ من أكتوبر إلى مايو؟ ومن قال أيضا أنه متحمس لتتابع الفصول المسرحية على الطريقة الغربية؟ مع العلم أن الطيب صديقي لا يعتبر تجربته المسرحية في جامع الفنا بمراكش مثلا نموذجا مثاليا، بقدر ما هي محاولة لكسر النمطية السائدة في المسرح المغربي والعربي، حيث أن شكل هذه التجربة ليس وحده المطلوب بقدر الحاجة إلى مسرح جوال ومسرح ريفي وأشكال تجارب عديدة تحاكي سر المكان الظاهر ولا تغرب الناس عن إطار حياتهم العامة. وفي نفس الفترة التي نجح فيها الغرب بأن يسوق لنا نموذج العلبة تحت وطئ الاستعمار، كانت اجتهادات التأمل في الفضاء المسرحي من أجل تطويعه وفق حاجات مسارحنا وتقاليدنا الفرجوية ضئيلة. هي ذاتها الفترة التي تصارع فيها المسرحيون في الغرب إلى مغادرة القاعات التقليدية، حيث أن عددا كبيرا منهم حسب ما يذكره غزافي فابر كان يقول أن آخر مكان يمكن فيه ممارسة المسرح هو هذا النوع من المسارح. أغلب الانتقادات تدور حول ما هو غير مرئي، حول الانغلاق، حول الزخارف المفرطة، الإطار المغلق جدا بين الجمهور والممثل. تاديوش كانتور كان شديد التأكد من أن المسرح من الممكن ممارسته في أي مكان عدا أن يكون داخل بناية المسرح. إن كانتور حسب جاك نيشي كان يخشى أن يكون المسرح مكانا لإعادة الإنتاج، في حين على المسرح أن يكون مكانا للخلق المتجدد. أكيد أن الانفتاح المكثف على مسارح العالم خلال ستينيات القرن الماضي مكن من اكتشاف الطقوس الفرجوية لحضارات أخرى تقترح طرقا مختلفة في العرض وفي تمثل الفضاء، وهو ما عبر عنه كلود فرانسوا في الخلاصات التي قدمها عن أشغال ندوة 1996 بلوفين لانوف. فخلال سنوات السبعين تمت مغادرة البنايات التقليدية. عدد من الفرق والمخرجين والسينوغرافيين ساهموا عبر خياراتهم الفنية في بروز دراماتورجيا مغايرة وعلاقات مختلفة في اللعب أمام الجمهور، لكن مجموع التجارب التي أنتجتها هذه الحركة الخلاقة لم تكن جميعها مبهجة. ذلك أن القاعات المرنة القابلة للتعديل أو المتعددة الاستعمالات خلقت حالات من التردد تحت إكراه التعقيدات التي يطرحها ثقل تجهيزاتها التقنية وصعوبات توظيفها، ما لا يمنع أن يكون حلم تليين أو تطويع الفضاء المسرحي من أجل الاستجابة للضرورات المتغيرة للعروض هو بشكل ما مسعى فني يتمتع بحرية أكثر اكتمالا مقابل الركون الدائم لنفس القالب. ومن ثم مكنت تجارب الستينيات والسبعينيات من بلورة مهارات متفردة في استخدام الأماكن الغير المتجانسة والأدوات ذات الميزات الخاصة، مع القدرة العالية في التأقلم مع الظروف المادية التي تشكل خاصية كل عرض. ومن غير المستغرب أنه في اللحظة التي أعادت فيها القاعات والخشبات التقليدية استمالة معظم ممارسي المسرح، نجحت الممارسات السينوغرافية الجديدة في الانتقال إلى مجالات مغايرة، ذلك أن المسرح من خلال الحاجات الحيوية لفنه أثار أسئلة وتأملات وتجارب مختبرية وطريقة في تصور الفضاء حولت وجهة السينوغراف نحو النشاط الموسع أكثر انفتاحاً بدل إنجاز ديكورات على خشبات المسارح القديمة. ومن هنا يأتي التساؤل عن إمكانية تطور العمل السينوغرافي داخل العمل المسرحي بمعزل عن تطور فضاءات العرض ومنها البناية المسرحية على وجه التحديد. ذلك أن العمارة بشكل عام والمسرح بشكل خاص متأخران دائما مقارنة بالممارسات والاستخدامات، وهذه من وجهة نظر كزافي فابر حقيقة لا يريد المهندسون المعماريون فهمها، مع العلم أنها أساسية لفهم العمارة. يشبه كزافي مينار الهندسة المعمارية بالنحت من حيث توظيفها ل3 أبعاد، غير أن النحت يتم النظر إليه والإحاطة به من الخارج، في حين يشبه المعمار منحوتة ضخمة مفرغة من الداخل يلج إليها الإنسان ليعيش تجربة داخلها. فالجانب الوظيفي هو المطمح الأول الذي يشتغل عليه المعماري، حين يكون المظهر الخارجي مجرد غشاء خال من المعنى ما لم يتم الولوج إلى قلب البناية لاستيعاب ما تم تصوره. الفراغ أو التجويف الداخلي هو الأهم مقابل المشهد الخارجي الذي يمكن تشبيهه بالكارت بوستال. يمكن القول أن الهندسة المعمارية الحقة تكمن في علاقتها بالوظيفة التي تؤديها وبالتجربة المكانية، كيف نستشعر الفضاء فيزيقيا روحيا وإنسانيا. يدعونا جي كلود فرانسوا أن نتخيل لو لم تعد بناية المسرح معلمة حضارية أو صالونا على مقاصي المدينة، بل محترفا يتم فيه إعداد العمل المسرحي، وأن تكون المعايير التي سوف تلهم المعمارية مستلهمة من طبيعة العمل المتحول والمتعدد لصانع الفرجة، وأن تقوم بين المتفرج والممثل علاقة انسجام، بمعنى علاقة متجددة تتغير وفق ما يتم منحه للنظر وللمسمع وللوجدان. وفي حالتنا المغربية لا شك أن تعدد قاعات العروض التي شيدت في السنين الأخيرة أنعشت الحركة المسرحية بشكل أكيد، لكن أغلبها لا يتماشى مع طموحات المبدعين والجمهور ما دام استنساخها يتم بشكل آلي غير متأمل فيه. أين يكمن موقع السونوغراف في عملية تصميم المباني المسرحية؟ هل يتمتع بدور فعال في تحديد احتياجات الفضاء المسرحي وتوجيه مسار التصميم؟ ما مدى حاجتنا إلى خشبة لها ستارة وإطار، إذ عادة ما يقتطع إطار الخشبة والستارة جزءا من عمق الخشبة، وتبدو مقدمة الخشبة منعزلة عما وراء الستارة ومحرومة من التجهيزات التقنية التي انحصرت في الخلف، عدا الإضاءة الساطعة المثبتة في مؤخرة الصالة، كما هو الحال في مسرح محمد الخامس على سبيل المثال. تبدو هذه المنطقة الحساسة ما بين الصف الأول من الجمهور والنقطة الأولى ما وراء الستار، والتي من المفروض أن تشكل النواة والمركز الحيوي الذي يشمل العارضة والمتلقي، تبدو نائية بأمتار. يعتبرها جي كلود فرانسوا نقطة سوداء، لأنها سواء بالنسبة للمخرج أو للسينوغراف أو لمصمم الإضاءة المنطقة الأصعب في التدبير، قدر سيء على نحو ما، في حين لا شيء يبرر أن تكون هذه الحواجز قائمة بشكل نهائي، وأن يتم منح المخرجين والسينوغرافيين إمكانية إعادة تنظيمها وفق خاصية كل عرض عبر توظيف العناصر الضرورية التي توافق التجهيز المفترض. لكن كيف يمكن ذلك ما دامت الفرق المسرحية لا تنتج أعمالها من داخل قاعات المسرح؟ إنها مجرد فرق لا تجد حتى مأوى لتتدرب. كيف سينجح العمل دون أن يختمر داخل البناية؟ كيف تنجح بعض الأعمال المسرحية بأعجوبة لغياب هذا التأقلم؟ ومن جانب التكوين داخل معاهد المسرح، هل يمكن للعمل السينوغرافي أن يتطور بمعزل عن تطور فضاءات العرض ومنها البناية المسرحية على وجه التحديد؟ ما طبيعة المهارات والخبرات التي يجب أن يتملكها السينوغراف ليكون قادراً على تصميم وإدارة مشاريع بناء الفضاءات المسرحية؟ كيف يمكن دمج المعرفة النظرية والمهارات العلمية في برامج التكوين لخلق جيل جديد من السينوغرافيين يتحلون بالقدرة على عدم الفصل بين السينوغرافيا والمكان الذي سوف يتم فيه تقديم العرض؟ ما هو الدور الذي يمكن أن تلعبه المؤسسات المعنية بتدريس المسرح والفنون الأدائية في تعزيز ثقافة التعاون بين مختلف الاختصاصات المعنية ببناء الفضاء المسرحي؟ كيف يمكن تعزيز التعاون بين المهندسين المعماريين والسينوغرافيين لخلق فضاءات مسرحية إبداعية تلبي احتياجات العروض المسرحية المختلفة؟ ثم ألم يحن الوقت لإدراج سينوغرافيا المعدات ضمن برامج التكوين في معاهد المسرح وكليات الهندسة؟ لأختم، ربما يكون الأهم الآن هو البحث عن وسائل الممكنة للتأثير في القرارات التي تتخذها تلك المؤسسات في إحداث بنايات وحثها على دعم الشراكات بين المهندسين المعماريين الذين يتكفلون بالبنايات والسينوغرافيين الذين يدركون الأوليات. كيف يمكن إقناع تلك المؤسسات بأهمية تصميم الفضاء المسرحي وفق مقاربات إبداعية تلبي احتياجات العروض المسرحية وتتجاوز النماذج وأنماط التفكير التقليدية؟ هذه بعض من الأسئلة التي علينا أن نتداولها على طاولة النقاش، وفي ثناياها إيقاظ الوعي بأن الأجنة لا تكتمل إلا داخل الرحم وإن كان اصطناعياً. ذلك ما نأمله للمسرح المغربي، وذلك ما نحلم به لباقي المسارح في عالمنا العربي. وشكراً على الإصغاء.
شكرا لكم أستاذ عبد المجيد على هذه الورقة التي تدعونا إلى إعادة النظر للدور الذي يمكن أن يلعبه السينوغرافي في تشكيل الفضاءات المسرحية عبر مستويات مختلفة، أملا في تحقيق فرجة شاملة ودعوة في تعزيز التعاون بين مختلف الاختصاصات المعنية في بناء الفضاء المسرحي. الآن وفي نفس الإطار تتفضل الباحثة صفية معناوي أستاذ المعهد العالي للفن المسرحي والتنشيط الثقافي في الرباط، ومحاضرة بعنوان الزي المسرحي المغربي بين مدارس التصميم وآليات الإنجاز. كل التوفيق.
أولاً أود أن أشكر الدكتور خالد أمين على هذه الدعوة الكريمة وعلى هذه الفرصة الثمينة. يعتبر الزي المسرحي عنصراً مهماً ضمن النسيج الفرجوي في مجموع التقاليد الفرجوية عبر العالم، كونه حاملاً للمعنى ووسيطاً ناقلاً لجماليات تخص كل تجربة من حيث القدرة على التطور والتجدد المستمر. هو رمز ركحي متحول يتسم بالمرونة بدل الثبات، يمكن أن يصير ديكوراً متحركاً أو إخراجاً مصغراً على حد تعبير باتريس بافيس، أو حتى جلداً ثانياً للممثل كما دعاه تايروف، كما أنه خاضع لتأثيرات التضخيم والتبسيط والتجريد والمقروئية حسب ما يؤكده ميشيل كورفان في قاموسه المسرحي. وفي وقت انفتحت فيه الآفاق المعاصرة لزخم الوسائط واندحار زمن النص الدرامي وما أعقب ذلك من أسئلة شكلت آفاق المسرح ما بعد درامي، يمكننا أن نلحظ نفس الأمر فيما يخص تجارب المسرح المغربي، حيث صار اشتغال مصمم الزي المسرحي المغربي اشتغالاً شمولياً مفتوح الآفاق، وراءه تصور فني مستقل ومتفاعل في ذات الآن، غير خاضع لأي تراتبية أو سلطة أحادية في تصور منجز. لذا صار لابد اليوم من مسائلة بيداغوجية تتناول المقررات وبرامج تكوين وطرق تدريس ووضعها تحت المجهر. لاستجلاء أفق يزيح اللبس عن الخلل في تناول الزي المسرحي بالمغرب. ولتحقيق ذلك سنطرح مجموعة من الأسئلة في هذه الورقة البحثية. فما هو الزي المسرحي؟ وما هي التفاعلات التي يدخل فيها مع عناصر الفرجة؟ وما هي العلل حسب رولان بارت التي يمكن أن تصيب تصورات عن الزي المسرحي؟ وكيف يمكن تدريسه اليوم وتصميمه، تدريس تصميم الزي المسرحي وتاريخه في مؤسساتنا اليوم؟ يعرف يانيس كوكوس الزي المسرحي قائلاً: كل شخص تواجد في حيز لعب، أي في وضعية يصير فيها مشاهداً سواء باستعمال النطق أو الحركة، فإن لباسه يصير زياً مسرحياً. ويضيف أن اللباس بمجرد ما يظهر على الخشبة يغدو زياً مسرحياً. إذن عبر فعل بسيط كما يصفه يانيس كوكوس وهو التواجد في حيز اللعب يصير اللباس زياً مسرحياً. هناك إذن تحليل ورؤية فنية يتحول معهما الزي من مجرد غطاء وغلاف خارجي للممثل ليصير مرتبطاً بجسده، يحقق وإياه في تواطؤ خلاق كل الاحتمالات الممكنة، ويوفر له أقصى إمكانات التعبير. يقيده بترسانة من المواد أحياناً، أو حتى يحرره من الأتواب أحياناً أخرى حذا العري. إن الزي المسرحي فاعل أساسي في العرض المسرحي، وله قوة تعبيرية تجعله تجسيداً إبداعياً متغيراً ومتجدداً، حيث يصير رمزاً ركحياً متحولاً لا يتسم بالثبات. فلوقت طويل كانت تستخدم للشخصية الواحدة نفس الملابس والأقنعة بشكل نمطي في كل العروض مهما اختلفت طبيعة كل عرض. ونستحضر هنا مثلا عروض تراجيديا والكوميديا ديلارتي ومسرح الكاتاكالي على سبيل التمثيل. لكن الزي المسرحي ظل دائما في تطور مستمر ليحتل اليوم في قلب العرض مكانا مهما ويعدد من وظائفه ويندمج في عمل المجموعة حول الدلالات المسرحية. ولعل أهم ما يميز الزي المسرحي هو أنه علامة بصرية قوية ونافذة ومكتملة الوجود، تتفاعل في نفس الآن مع الفضاء والممثل وتؤثر بشكل مباشر في طريقة أدائه. يمكن اعتباره جزءاً لا يتجزأ من السينوغرافيا، فهو جزء من نسيجها، ديكوراً متحركاً شديد الإيحاء يعبر في أحيان كثيرة وببلاغة عما يصعب قوله. إنه عبر بروزه يخفي أكثر مما يبوح. فكيف يتفاعل الزي إذن مع باقي عناصر الفرجة؟ وما حدود هذه التفاعلات؟ وما أهمية استيعاب دارسي تصاميم الأزياء لهذه التفاعلات حتى يتمكنوا من تصميم الزي المسرحي؟ يتفاعل الزي بعلاقات تشكيلية وبصرية وجمالية مع مجمل عناصر الفرجة المسرحية. تفاعل يتم وفق صيرورة تواصلية، فاشتغال مصمم الأزياء هو اشتغال شامل يفترض انسجام وتكاثف مجموعة من العناصر الفنية ضمن لفيف صناع الفرجة من مخرج وسينوغراف وممثل ومصمم مكياج ومبدع أكسسوارات وصانعها وما إلى ذلك. علاقات تنظيمية وبصرية وجمالية، ويشترك مع عناصر العرض المسرحي. إن عن طريق هذه العلاقات يستطيع المصمم تجديد الأفكار المطروحة والمفروضة عن طريق البنية الدرامية للحدث المسرحي. ذلك أنه يسعى عبر مجموع هذه التفاعلات والعلاقات لتحقيق صورة بصرية ذات أبعاد جمالية محفوفة برمزيتها وعمق دلالاتها، ولا يحقق أي تصور ممكن للأزياء غاياته إلا بتوافقه وانسجامه وتفاعله مع كل هذه المكونات، مع العلم أن الصورة البصرية النهائية للزي لن تتحقق إلا بتكاملها مع حضور الممثل، وهو بصدد الفعل وفي اللحظة التي يتم فيها استقبال العرض من طرف المشاهد. الشيء الذي يحتم على الدارس تلقي تكوينات في جميع هذه المجالات حتى يتمكن من التوفر على نظرة شاملة تقوده لإنجاح تصاميمه. من أهم العناصر التي يتفاعل مع الزي هي الممثل، والممثل كجسد هي العلاقة الحتمية الأولى. فكيف لهذا الزي أن يكون ليتوحد مع جسد الممثل، يتزيى به فيصير شخصية أخرى؟ وكم من الوقت تحتاجه هذه الأتواب لتتوالف مع هذا الجسد دون أن تؤذيه؟ في دراسة جماعية موسومة بفنون واستعمالات لباس الخشبة تؤكد أن فيردي أن الزي لا بد أن يكون مريحا وملائما لجسد الممثل حتى لا يعيق أداءه، فارتباطه بجسده علاقة حتمية. هذا الارتباط الوثيق أساس العملية التحولية التي يخضع لها اللباس ليصير زيا مسرحيا. جسد الممثل إذن هو المثل الأول الذي يعتمده الزي، والأساس أن يكون مريحا وملائما حتى يمكن جسد الممثل من جميع وظائفه. إن الزي المسرحي هو العلامة الأولى المرتبطة بجسد الممثل، ويبعث عبره مجموعة من العلامات التي لا يمكن شرحها إلا عبر فهم شامل للرؤية العامة. في نفس السياق يريد ميشيل أزاما أن الزي هو الجلد الثاني للممثل ولا يفترق عن كيانه، وبمثابة القناع الظاهر لصورته الركحية التي يلزمه أن تتماهى وإياه لأقصى الحدود لدرجة لا يمكن فصل واحد عن الآخر، مثلما لا يمكن أن نحذف كلمة من أغنية أو نستبدلها دون أن نشوه المعنى. إن الزي والجسد حلفاء، فالممثل يجب أن يبرز وظيفة الزي ويتعامل معه كما لو كان جلده الثاني، والزي يجب أن يكون مريحا حتى يحقق وحدة مثلى. يحمل الزي دورا ملموسا يتمثل في توجيه المشاهد نحو عالم تم تحديد رموزه مسبقا، وحسب بارت يجب أن يكون ملفتا دون أن يلاحظ، وأن يكون له معنى دون تضخمات، وأن يكون علامة على فترة زمنية أو اختيارات جمالية دون أن يتجاوز إطار هذه الوظائف أو أن يشوش على العلامات الأخرى للعرض. ويؤكد بارت أنه لا يجب أن يكون زي المسرح بأي حال من الأحوال عذراً أو تبريراً، وألا يكون بقعة بصرية براقة وكثيفة تشتت الانتباه بعيداً عن الواقع الأساسي للعرض، ما يمكن تسميته بالمسؤولية. وبالإضافة إلى ذلك لا يجب أن يكون الزي عذراً أو عنصراً للتعويض عن الصمت أو النقص في عمل ما. ويعرف رولان بارت الزي المسرحي الجيد على أنه مجموعة من العلامات التي تحمل دلالات مرئية ويلخص الصفات التي يجب أن يتصف بها الزي السليم، وأهمها على الزي والخلفية المسرحية أن تحترم الجسد وأن تعبر عن كل صفاته، وكلما كانت العلاقة بين الزي ومحيطه عضوية كلما ازدادت حجة الزي قوة. على مصمم الأزياء أن يحقق التوافق الذكي بين الزي وخلفيته التي تعد من أهم قوانين المسرح. على الزي المسرحي أن يكون كثيفاً بالقدر الذي يضمن له أن يثبت دلالاته، وشفافاً بالقدر الذي يمنع العلامات من توليد علامات أخرى طفيلية. الزي كتابة لديها ما لديها من تناقض وغموض، فالكتابة أداة توظف في خدمة موضوع يتجاوزها، وحين تفرط الكتابة في السوء أو الجودة، في القبح أو الجمال، فإنها تغدو غير صالحة للقراءة وتكون قد خانت مهمتها. إن تدريس تاريخ الزي المسرحي بالمغرب منذ بداية تأسيسه حتى ولوجه قاعات الدرس كتخصص فني مستقل وتتبع مساره حتى صار تخصصاً مهنياً له آلياته وتقنياته ليس بالمهمة اليسيرة. كيف لها أن تكون كذلك والمسرح المغربي عانى ولا زال يعاني من مشكلات في التأريخ ويتأرجح بين الكتابة وإعادة الكتابة وبين المحو والتصحيح، ويحتاج لإعادة طرح التساؤلات وزعزعة محطات تاريخية صارت ثابتة حد التقديس. ليس الأمر تعميقاً للخلط والالتباس أو رغبة نرجسية في ادعاء المعرفة التعالي، ولا هو مرقص مسعور حول الذات كما دعاه العروي، بل هو اصطدام بهي مع أطروحات أتت مستقيمة لتستقر مكان ما استقر قبلها، لا لتحور وتختلق، بل لتجلي الغموض وتنير المعتم دون حاجة لجز أو تقليم، لحشو أو توليف، حتى تناسب مقاربتنا وسياقها التي نسعى من خلالها لاستجلاء تاريخ المضمر فيه أكثر من المعلن. فمنذ التحاقنا بالمعهد العالي للفن المسرحي والتنشيط الثقافي ونحن نتساءل مثلاً عن سبب غياب تاريخ الزي المسرحي المغربي من المقررات، فهل ينحصر تاريخ الأزياء في تاريخ الزي الغربي؟ إن تدريس الزي المسرحي يتطلب وعياً تاريخياً، ودونه لا يمكن لمصمم الزي الطالب أن يبدع أو أن يخلق طرقاً لأسلبة هذا التاريخ، وهذا ما يؤكده تشارلز بيانشيني حين يدعو مصممي الأزياء اليافعين إلى حفظ وتوثيق آلاف اللوحات التاريخية، وتمثل بالنسبة له هذه الطريقة المثلى لتكوين مصممي الأزياء. إن الزي المسرحي هو نتاج سياق ثقافي زاخر ذي خصوصية تجعله متجذراً في تربة وعمق ذاته، ولا بد من تأسيس علاقة مع الآخر محركها التناسج لا الوصاية والقطيعة مع التاريخ. لذلك نحاول دراسة وتدريس الزي المسرحي بالمغرب وتعريف الطلبة بتجارب مصممي الزي المغاربة للتعريف على آليات اشتغالهم، فلا يمكن كأساتذة للفنون المسرحية أن ننساق نحن أيضاً في نسج أعمى وسرد أجوف ووصف مداهن لتاريخ وضعه الغرب واتفق عليه السلف. ولست أتشبث بهوية زائفة أو عمياء كما دعاها الخطيبي، لكن كمصممة أزياء مغربية لا أستطيع أن أقبل فكرة أن الزي المسرحي هدية جاءتنا في علبة مغلقة أهداها لنا الغرب الكريم وفتحناها لنتعلم برفق آليات هذا الفن. نحن لا نحارب، وباعتبار الزي جوهر اشتغالنا ميدانيا وأكاديميا، وله لدينا الأولوية في تجربتنا المسرحية وتتبعنا لمسارات التطور التي عرفها الزي المسرحي المغربي، يجعلنا واثقين من القيمة الإبداعية لمجموع السينوغرافيين ومصممي الزي المسرحي المغاربة الذين استطاعوا أن يحققوا التفرد والريادة في مجموعة من التخصصات. لقد صارت هذه التجارب تاريخاً يمثل هويتنا، وصار توثيق وتدريس تجارب مصممي أزياء مسرحيين مغاربة لم يكتب لها ذلك مسؤولية، بل وضرورة ملحة، حتى لا ننسى تجارب مثل تجربة العربي اليعقوبي أو ماريا الصديقي أو رفيقة بن ميمون. وحتى لا ننسى كان اللقاء بكم اليوم أساسياً، فشكراً للمركز الدولي لدراسات الفرجة على هذه الفرصة الثمينة. شكراً على الإصغاء.
شكرا لك دكتورة. شكرا دكتورة صفية معناوي. شكرا لهذه الورقة القيمة التي تؤكد الدور المؤسسي للزي المغربي في صياغة المعنى الفني والجمالي وفي إطار النسيج الفرجوي، باعتباره نافذة مكتملة الوجود شديدة الإيحاء ومكتملة الدلالات. الآن ننتقل إلى المشاركة الثالثة، الدكتور هشام الشامي، أستاذ في مجال الموسيقى الإثنية بجامعة ييل في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، متخصص في التراث الموسيقي الجبلي في شمال المغرب. Just want to inform that the presentation will be in English language. المداخلة ستكون باللغة الإنجليزية. فكل التوفيق دكتور.
شكرا على التقديم. Thank you for the introduction. كما شرح الأستاذ غتكون المداخلة باللغة الإنجليزية كون اللغة الأكاديمية ديالي، وطبعا النقاش وإذا كان شي تعقيب ولا أسئلة يقدروا يكونوا بالعربي ولا بالإنجليزية من بعد. بسم الله. A persistent challenge in performance studies stubbornly remains: how to define performance in ways that more broadly encompass the diversity of non-Western cultural practices. While much of Western performance theory relies on written texts, scripts, and formalized structures, non-Western cultures, particularly those steeped in oral tradition, present an alternative model, one where performance becomes a vital means of transmitting cultural knowledge, identity, and in my case, narratives of resistance. Scholars such as Diana Tyler, whose concept of the repertoire emphasizes embodied cultural memory over written archives, and Richard Schechner, who advocates for viewing performance as an interconnected practice across cultures, challenge the dominance of Western blueprints and call for more expansive, inclusive definitions of performance. In academia at large, Arab scholars like Hussam Abu al-Ala critique cultural studies through a post-colonial lens, rejecting Western imperialist hegemony and advocating for the recognition of indigenous knowledge systems. Moroccan scholar Khalid Amin pushes this further by applying these critiques to local performance traditions, arguing for the validation of Moroccan cultural practices on their own terms, rather than through imposed Western frameworks. Grounded in these perspectives, I argue that both Western and non-Western approaches offer equally valid methodologies, and privileging one over the other perpetuates colonial hierarchies. Before advancing further, I want to clarify that I do not posit the Western approach to performance as a standard against which non-Western traditions are measured, nor do I hold that the praxis of non-Western performance is imitative of European models. Rather, both frameworks are deserving of recognition in their own right. This paper operates firmly within the ethos of scholars like Rustum Barucha and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who emphasize this imperative of viewing non-Western traditions on their own terms, within their own cultural logic. Following the footsteps of these scholars, I argue that recognizing the full complexity of non-Western performance traditions allows for a more holistic understanding of their cultural, political, and historical significance. This paper examines one such tradition, Raqsat al-Barud, the rifle dance, as a case study through which to address larger questions surrounding performance, identity, and cultural transmission in the post-colonial era. Rooted in the historical resistance against Spanish colonialism, Raqsat al-Barud is not simply a dance, but rather a multi-layered cultural performance that brings together martial choreography, oral poetry, and communal rituals that have been preserved across generations by the Jbala people of northwest Morocco. At its core, the dance functioned as a repository of collective memory, a reenactment of courageous resistance against colonial forces, and an expression of pride, l'az, in the region's martial prowess. However, this potent form of cultural expression is increasingly under threat. In the post-independence era, the commodification of traditional practices for cultural tourism, both foreign and local, has begun to strip away their deeper meanings, reducing performances like Raqsat al-Barud to mere spectacle, fraja. Younger generations of Jbala, detached from the ritual's historical context, risk perceiving it only as showmanship, further jeopardizing the dance's transmission as an authentic cultural vehicle. As with many performance traditions across the globe, the tension between preservation and adaptation, cultural continuity and commodification raises critical questions. How can traditions like Raqsat al-Barud be preserved in a way that respects their historical and cultural significance? How can cultural practices that originated in resistance to colonial oppression avoid becoming reified symbols of an exoticized past? This paper aims to answer these questions by providing an in-depth analysis of Raqsat al-Barud, focusing on its historical roots, its evolving function in contemporary Jbala society, and the challenges it faces today. Through an examination of its anatomy, a triad comprised of its choreography, lyrics, and musical accompaniment, this study will argue that the dance remains a powerful symbol of resistance and cultural identity. However, its viability as a living tradition depends on its ability to engage both performance and audiences in ways that honor its historical significance while adapting modern cultural realities. Through the case of Raqsat al-Barud, I posit that the key to preserving such traditions lies not merely in maintaining their aesthetic form, but ensuring that the deeper historical and cultural meanings are continually reinterpreted and revitalized within their communities. As Richard Bowen contends, narratives of the past need not be marked by an inflexible and passive fixity, as long as the people of the present actively engage with them, invoking a sense of agency and endowing particular cultural forms with value and authority. Rooted in the region's legacy of resistance against Spanish colonialism, Raqsat al-Barud interweaves elements of cultural expression through artistic storytelling, which mobilizes the indigenous poetic genre of Al-Ayt al-Jabaliya in narrating the martial prowess of Jibli riflemen. Its performance serves as a powerful cultural preservation tool, inserting that the stories of anti-colonial uprisings embedded in the collective memory of the Jbala people are passed down through generations. In this paper, I draw on 4 iterations of the contemporary practice of Raqsat al-Barud as observed in the field: historical enactment in the countryside milieu of Khamis Lanjra, Jibel Habib, and Lakhmas, and the commodified and truncated versions of a wedding held at an upscale hotel in Tangiers. This dance, deriving its name al-Barud from the symbolism of gunpowder, is executed by a group ranging from 6 to 16 riflemen, referred to as al-Bardiya, and encompasses both synchronized movements and gestures by the entire ensemble as well as individual showcases. The preparation for the Barud dance commenced well in advance, as the Bardiya gather outside the village and organize themselves into formation before proceeding towards the designated performance area. During the 3 performances I witnessed, the Bardiya entered the Djar, rural settlement, in a single line. However, in 2 separate conversations, Al-Arabi Zwawi, Muqaddim of the Brahma Bardiya, and Absalam Talib, a member of the Khamis Lanjra Bardiya, mentioned that the entrance formation may vary depending on the number of participants involved. Nonetheless, the primary objective remains consistent: to create the impression of a military convoy advancing towards the battlefield. As the Bardiya move closer to the performance area, they start firing their rifles, klatas, in unison, aiming either towards the ground or the sky, in a maneuver known as a talqa, not only to ensure the functionality of their weapons, but also as an oral invitation for the general public to attend the performance. Once in place, the Bardiya adopt either one of the 2 formations. They gather either in a closed circle, with the leader positions at the center, like you see here, or facing each other on the sideline. In this photo from a reenactment in Chefchaouen, note the traditional halqa-style configuration with musicians playing the gaita and tabal to the side and black gunpowder remnants on the plaza. Irrespective of the war's context, preparation for and execution of the Barud dance invariably encompass distinct phases. Among these is the psychological groundwork laid for the combatants. Their morale must be high, and they must believe in the value of the battle they are about to engage in. It is precisely at this juncture that the Aita comes into play, with poetic verses exalting past glories, emphasizing dignity and honor, or depicting the hardships endured by the forefathers. As the Bardiya gather into formation, each delivers 1 stanza before yielding to the next participant, creating a kinesthetic, musical, and textual performative triad. It is a nonlinear process with no deliberate sequence in the selection of verses drawn for the extensive repertoire comprising Ayat al-Barud. In a specific inquiry regarding what prompts the selection of one stanza over another, I solicited Al-Arabi. He candidly responded that there is no set rationale behind their selection process. It is all generated at the spur of the moment, particularly when the performance occurs within the confines of a distinct tribe. At times, you know, he said, if you're in, let's say, Lakhmas, you will sing Tartaq al-Barud fi Lakhmas Ughzawa. Why? Because you know that people from Lakhmas would like it. Same thing if you're in the Ghmaras, you'll sing Al-Askar Spanyon Jama' fi Dradra, Al-Qubtan Qapas Hajm ala Ghmara. And the moment you say Ghmara, you shoot the rifle, and the woman would ululate, Zagret, or sing Salatu Salam. While the movement of the riflemen and the rhythmic beats of the tabla and ghaita create the visual and auditory components of the ritual, it is the text of the Ayat al-Barud that delivers the narrative, weaving together history, identity, and resistance in verse. The poetic content of these lyrics is essential, as it provides the context and emotional depth that imbues the performance with meaning beyond more choreography or spectacle. The stanzas are not randomly chosen, but rather act as a historical vignettes that call upon the audience to remember specific events, battles, and sacrifices made by the Jbala people in their fight against colonial oppression. In the performances of Al-Barud I attended, only verses 1, 3, 4, 6, 9, 10, 13, 15, and 19, 20, and 25 formed the core repertoire used in various permutations. The content and the ordering of the rest of the stanzas were provided in separate interviews. When the leader senses that the fighter's morale has reached the desired level, he proceeds to the next phase of the performance, leading to climax and catharsis. His voice resounds, breaking free with the resolute cry of "Wah ya al-ulad," a contraction of the Arabic "Ya ayyuha al-awlad," which in military parlance could be understood as "ready to charge." This rallying cry ignites a sense of unity, determination, and readiness among the Buardia, with the elongated "ah" at the beginning intensifying its motivational impact. The single syllable utterance "ah" lasts as long as the rest of the phrase, and as it reverberates in the air, it serves as unifying force, bringing together these Buardias who share a common purpose and an unwavering commitment to their cause, that of defeating the imaginary enemy. As this is addressed to a collective, it also instills a deep sense of camaraderie among its members, reminding them that they are part of a tightly knit brotherhood, bound together by duty and loyalty. In this sense, it transcends its literal translation, becoming a rallying call that embodies the indomitable spirit of Buardia, a testament to their resilience, their unyielding determination, and their unbreakable bond as they charge forward together, ready to face any challenge. The cry is accompanied by specific movements, with fingers resting on the trigger. The leader, mimicked by the entire group, swiftly moves the weapon from one shoulder to another, while his eyes focus show intensity and readiness to spring into action. And then he freezes. This momentary 3 to 5 seconds pause holds immense significance, highlighting a pivotal juncture in the dance. It symbolizes a critical point where the Buardia, embodying warriors in battle, demonstrate their alertness and preparedness for imminent action. It is as if time stands still, allowing the audience to observe the gravity of the impending conflict. After the pause, the dance resumes with a burst of energy and a series of movements in which the fighters simulate combat techniques, showcasing their agility, strength, and coordination. Each movement carries meaning, portraying various aspects of warfare such as strategic positioning, swift attacks, and defensive maneuvers. The rhythm of the music intensifies through the dance, mirroring the rising tension and adrenaline of a real battle. The fighters showcase their skillful footwork, precise timing, and synchronized movements, creating an atmosphere of excitement and anticipation. They do so while maintaining a strong sense of unity and discipline. The climax of Al-Barud dance often involves a dramatic finale. It could include simulated battle encounters or symbolic victories, before concluding with a display of unity and triumph. The Buardia join hands and triumphantly raising them high in sign of solidarity and celebrating the successful completion of their mission. What then is the value of this time-honored tradition on a personal and societal level to those who perform it and observe it? First, it reinforces key historical deeds through the storytelling modality of the Aitat al-Barud and uses the critical vehicle of oral transmission among the Buardia to enrich the repertoire. In addition, the performance of Raqsat al-Barud reminds audiences of the legendary martial prowess of al-Buardia, inspiring regional pride, al-'azz, and strengthening collective memory. Al-Arabi reminisced about past days when, after concluding their performance, the troupe would leave the host to their festivities, while the Buardia, joined by other musicians, would spend the night reciting known pieces from the repertoire while improvising new stanzas. Back in the day, he says, I remember when we would finish, we'd leave the host to their celebrations along with the Tabala and Ghayata, and we Buardia would move to a spacious place where a large tent was erected or to an adjacent house. People would be very generous with us. They would serve us food and tea, and we would spend the night there, and we would be joined by other musicians when they were done. Our celebration would begin with the Aita, reciting everything we know from the repertoire. Our ancestors, Jdudna, did the same, except that for them it was real. Commenting on what happened on the day, and then, in the upcoming battle, whatever it might take place, they would recite what they had come up with that day before adding to it. And this is how most of the songs were composed. As I listened to Al-Arabi, his recollections of the glory days of the Buardia and the ways in which they have kept the repertoire alive among themselves, I detected a palpable shift in tone as a narrative turned to Jdudna, our ancestors. While placing himself and his fellow Bouardia within their lineage, transmitting their repertoire, his tone of veneration was unmistakable as he said, for them it was real. I heard his story as an homage to those who had yielded arms during battle and documented their deeds via the vehicle of the Aita, something that would survive beyond themselves. In that sense, although there was an element of romanticizing in Al-Arabi's recollection, he presented the ancestors, Jdudna, as part of the lineage of artistic transmission that he and his colleagues were perpetuating. For me, Al-Barud was not just about dancing or waving the rifle around. It's about our roots, who we are. Our ancestors did it to show their strength in tough times. When I mimic them, I feel like I'm carrying that spirit forward. This is not just tradition, it is history, our history. This is the Azz of Jbala. We, meaning they, resisted the occupation. We, meaning they, kicked Spaniards out. We want our kids to see it. While Barud dance has evolved over time, its significance as a cultural expression of valor, bravery, and resilience remains intact. Through this mimetic dance, the Jbala community pays tribute to its ancestors, preserves its heritage, and reinforces its collective identity. It serves as a reminder of the region's historical struggles against the colonizers and the perseverance of its people. The carefully curated and flawlessly executed version of Raqsat al-Barud, as recounted by a consummate Bouardi and observed with my own eyes, is by no means consistently reproduced in an authentic manner in the public square. In one of our conversations with regard to this challenge, Al-Arabi expressed his frustration with the lack of understanding and appreciation among today's youth for the profound meaning behind these movements. The youngsters of today, he said, do not understand the significance of the movement. They don't understand why is it that when I raise the rifle, when I raise it, they don't know why I switch shoulders. They don't know why I move my feet the way I do. They don't know that some steps mean advancing towards the enemy and attacking. Some steps means retreating. All they're interested in is the fraja, showmanship, and the talqa, the firing of the weapon. I would observe this disconnect while attending a wedding at Qa'at al-Anwar in the company of the ensemble of Lahsan al-Arus al-Tanjawi, engaged to play for this occasion. The evening's entertainment include a set of 3 folkloric tableaux expressly requested by the bride and groom. These traditional Ghibli dances would supply elements of ritual performance imbued with local meaning, conjuring up familiar aspects of Ghibli history and culture. Riflery used in battle, Raqsat al-Barud, harvesting of the crops, tawaza, and hospitality associated with tea, Raqsat Siniya. During these dances, the guests generally remained engaged in their own conversations and seemed disinterested by the traditional tableau, except for the occasional snapshot or amused countenance. The ambient atmosphere of the venue remained largely unaffected by the visual array unfolding around them. Not performed in situ, divorced from its ritual roots, the costuming for each dance suggested its original open-air, agricultural, and village settings, with the formal banquet hall environment not allowing the slightest approximation of these local costumes. To what extent would this audience have an opportunity to gain an appreciation of the generation-old symbolism and historical context of which these dance rituals have emerged? Would this factor instead just lost in translation, resulting in mere entertainment, even providing occasional for ridicule? Lahsan commented on the guests' tepid responses, admitting that, quote, "We're here just for the folklore. We look good. We have the dancers with us. They just want a bit of folklore in this wedding. They're basically saying, see, we're celebrating our roots as Jbala." Yet, ironically, aspects of this event diminish the impact of these potent rituals, in particular the limitations of the physical space and the uncertainty regarding the audience comprehension of these dances. I can only conclude that the danger for Orientalist interpretations within the arena of cultural tourism exists when these truncated rituals are enacted for external audiences, raising the unwelcome specter of neo-colonialism. In order to restore meaning to traditions such as Raqsat al-Barud, I advocate for deeper engagement with the historical context of these traditions so that ritual becomes perceived as living history, rather than an irrelevant relic of bygone Ghibli culture. This entails interrogating the intersection of performance, knowledge, and power within the Ghibli resistance narrative and linking the enactment of Raqsat al-Barud to initiative promoting decolonization and preservation of marginalized cultures within the kingdom. Pedagogy can be an effective vehicle in mentoring young people in authentic performance techniques, contributing to the accurate transmission of these dances by encouraging historically correct instruction. Ultimately, it becomes imperative for cultural bearers, their audiences, and their cultural infrastructure at large to maintain a milieu of respect and honor towards centuries-old tradition, refusing to commodify or trivialize their performance as source of gratuitous entertainment. The question posed at the outset of this paper, how can traditions like Raqsat al-Barud be preserved in ways that respect their historical significance, and how can these traditions avoid becoming mere relics in exoticized past, demand a nuanced response rooted in the commitment to cultural integrity. Raqsat al-Barud, like many performance traditions anchored in anti-colonial resistance, is not just a visual spectacle. It is a form of living history, a dynamic expression of identity, pride, and collective memory that continues to hold profound meaning for the Jbala people. Yet, as I have argued, the forces of commodification and cultural tourism threaten to strip these performances of their deeper significance, rendering them little more than fraja for external audiences and disconnected younger generations. The answer lies not in freezing these traditions in an artificial nostalgic past, but in actively re-engaging with their historical and cultural context. Raqsat al-Barud must be understood as a form of embodied resistance, where every movement, every beat of the drum, and every poetic verse recited is a testament to the resilience of the Jbala people and their enduring fight against colonial oppression. What's at stake here is more than the preservation of an art form. It is the preservation of a people's right to define themselves and their history. Khalid Amin's work on the halqa reminds us that performance is not only an aesthetic act, but also an assertion of identity in the face of external pressures. Similarly, Raqsat al-Barud offers a powerful narrative of cultural self-determination, underscoring that Jibli culture has not only survived colonization, but has continued to evolve and adapt. The key then is to ensure that this evolution is driven by the community itself rather than the market forces or touristic demands. There is no room for neutrality when it comes to the preservation of traditions like Raqsat al-Barud. Cultural institutions, educators, and community leaders must take a firm stand in advocating for the ritual's authenticity. In a world where globalization and cultural homogenization threaten the survival of local traditions, Raqsat al-Barud must remain a bastion of cultural pride and resilience. If we fail to protect the deeper meaning behind these performances, we risk allowing them to be co-opted and hollowed out, reducing them to little more than entertainment for the benefit of external spectators. But if we succeed in revitalizing this ritual as a form of living history, we will not only preserve the legacy of the Jbala people, we will ensure that future generations inherit a tradition that is both culturally meaningful and empowering. This ultimately is the challenge and the responsibility of those who care about the preservation of non-Western performance traditions. And it is a responsibility we must embrace wholeheartedly. Shukran. Thank you.
Shukran, Doctor. Shukran. Many thanks for the insightful paper, which spat the light on the very vital areas of Moroccan heritage, intellectual interpretation of Raqsat al-Barud according to the cultural performance and the social roots. We don't have time. We will go directly to the discussion between the participant and the scholars. And unfortunately, we have only 15 minutes, so we'll go to the discussion.
محمد المهنا المعهد العالي للفنون المسرحية. شكرا حق المتحدثين في هذه الجلسة، ولدي مداخلة وقد يكون فيها يعني قرب من الورقة اللي طرحها الأستاذ عبد المجيد الهواس وربما أيضا دكتورة صفية. فيما يخص السينوغرافيا، استشفيت من الطرح أن في دعوة لإعادة النظر في الطريقة اللي نتناول فيها تعليم السينوغرافيا في المستويات المتخصصة. كوني أدرس في قسم النقد والأدب المسرحي، فالمخرجات في العادة تتعاطى مع كافة عناصر العرض المسرحي. فنعرف ان احنا كميه المحتوى اللي يتعرض له الطلبه فيما يخص السينوغرافيا خارج اقسام السينوغرافيا قليل نسبيا. فودي اعرف رايكم في الاليات الممكنه لتطوير المعرفه والاطلاع على السينوغرافيا في المسارات الجديده بالنسبه لغير المختصين في السينوغرافيا، يعني مثلا بالنسبه لمن ينقد السينوغرافيا من الأقسام العلمية الثانية. هذا يعني فيما يختص العلاقة ما بين السينوغرافيا والأقسام الأخرى المعنية في شؤون المسرح. وشكرا لكم جزيلا.
شكرا لهذا المداخلات. عندي واحد السؤال للأستاذ. واش في علمك دابا عندنا واحد السياسه في المغرب ديال المشاريع الكبرى ديال في ميدان المسرح مثلا مع البناء ديال المسرح ديال الرباط وديال مدينه الدار البيضاء، واش كاين واحد المشاركه ديال الناس ديال المسرح وديال السينوغرافيه في هذه المشاريع؟ وشكرا.
Thank you very much, dear professors, for this primordial intervention. So my question is just to ask the professor to clarify what does he mean by رقصة صينية. So this is what I want to know.
Hi, thank you all for your talks. It was very interesting, and yeah, I'm happy to be here listening to you. So my question is for Dr. Shami. I'm curious if you could share a little more about the sounds of the rifle dance. So you mentioned an intensification of rhythm, and I'm curious if that's like, you know, a tempo acceleration, or there's more complexity in the rhythm, or what changes. I'm also really curious about the way that these stanzas come up. Are they usually, you know, sung in order? Are they all sung at one time? Would they be, you know, different shows have different combinations of stanza? That's my question. Thank you.
Yes, a question for Professor Shami. You mentioned, it's interesting because you have observed this رقصة البارود in a kind of traditional sort of community context, but also in a kind of a newer, on a newer stage, which is, you know, like social rituals such as weddings. Can you tell us a bit more about what you observed in the context of integrating this traditional kind of raqsa in a social occasion like weddings? I mean, because you mentioned the idea that there is this kind of disconnection between, especially between the performance and the younger generation. I'd be curious to hear what you saw, like in situ, when this was kind of like offered as a kind of spectacle or as a kind of entertainment on such an occasion. And thank you.
Yeah, just a small little question to Professor Shami. If there is, do you have any alternative solutions for the preservation of رقص البارود, other than market it as a, because you seem to not to resist, not to like the idea that is being used in tourism, and what do you suggest as an alternative for the preservation, other than just expose it to people? People have to see it, and then we can preserve it through making it alive all the time. Thank you.
مرحبا. أنا أشكر الأساتذة الكرام على هذه المداخلات العميقة والمفيدة التي سبحت بنا في فضاءات متعددة من أشكال من الفرجة والأداءات. أريد أن أتفاعل مع مداخلة الأستاذ الشامي حول منطقة جبالة وحول البارود وحول تبوريدة، وأريد أن أتفاعل معه خصوصا لأنني أنحدر من تلك المنطقة التي يتحدث عنها، وأنحدر أيضا من تلك التقاليد، كان عدد من أفراد عائلتي أيضا انخرطوا في مثل هذه الطقوس الاحتفالية، بما في ذلك جدي عليه واسع الرحمة والمغفرة. أنا أريد وأيضا عملت في مناطق قريبة حيث كان يسود هذا النوع من الطقوس. في منطقة تزروت كانت لديهم الكثير من الأداءات والفرجات المتعلقة بالتبوريدة والبارود والاحتفال بالانتصارات والاستعداد للمعارك وما إلى ذلك، خصوصا في عهد شريف الريسوني. يعني كانت هذه التقاليد راسخة في تلك الفترة. أنا أريد فقط أن أستفيد من خبرته في هذا المجال ومن الدراسات العميقة التي قام بها حول هذا الموضوع فيما يتعلق بالأشكال التي قمتم بعرضها. هل تتعلق تلك الأشكال لي فورم كو فوزافي بريزونتي، هل تتعلق بأشكال رمزية أم أنها أشكال عفوية؟ بمعنى هل كانت مرتبطة بأداءات تؤدي وظيفة سيميائية ووظيفة رمزية حول طقس معين، أم كانت مجرد أشكال مرتبطة بما هو عفوي، ما هو فرجوي، ما هو أدائي بالمعنى الاحتفالي للكلمة؟ هذه من نقطة. ثم منطقة بني عروس كانت تعرف بعض الشخصيات المهمة في مسألة تبوريدة تسمى شيخ الرماية، شيخ الرمى. وأنا أعرف أن أستاذي سي محمد أنقار كان قد كتب رواية مهمة جدا حول هذا الموضوع وأرخت لهذه المنطقة، وأستاذ أنقار تواصل مباشرة مع حفيد لشيخ من شيوخ الرماية يقولوا له محمد بن زيان، وكان جده شيخا من شيوخ الرماية، وكان يقوم بأداءات غاية في الخطورة تتعلق بعملية تصويب تجاه فرد من أفراد أسرته على نحو. على كل حال الأستاذ سي الشامي قد يفيدنا أكثر في هذا الموضوع، وأتمنى أن أتفاعل معه إن شاء الله في فرصة لكي نتبادل أكثر في هذا الشأن، وشكرا جزيلا لكم.
Thank you all for your speeches and thoughts. I don't have a question, but I would like to share my feedback or reflection as a director. I'm not a scientist. So what was popping up in my mind concerning the architecture and also set design was that we all use the word post-colonialism a lot in the moment, and it's like a fashion. And what was popping up in my mind was as well that the representative buildings was coming also from the kingdoms. So, and this is my question, or that moves me to rethink it, because what I experienced in my country, but also in abroad here, for example, is that it's still liked by the society to be part of this representative aspect of the buildings. So it's a big question mark to myself. And on the other side, or the other thing what popping up was concerning the costumes and the comfortability to actors. And my thought is that if we are based in the team of artists in the process of creation, and if the base is the respect to each other, then you can also force actors while you are putting costumes on them, what provoke maybe not the comfortable second skin, but provoke different movements. So when you are thinking theater as a expression on movement, that was my thoughts. And thank you all. Thank you for the conference.
صباح الخير. عندي سؤال أود أن أتقاسمه مع الأستاذ عبد المجيد الهواس حول طبيعة العلاقة التي تجمع ما بين السينوغراف والنص المسرحي. هل السينوغراف يكتفي فقط بالعرض المرئي لفحوى النص المسرحي، أم أن السينوغراف يحاول بتصوره وحسب نظرته للعمل المسرحي أن يقدم معاني أخرى وتفسيرات أخرى للجمهور؟ وفي هذا السياق أسأل عن طبيعة العلاقة التي تجمع كذلك السينوغرافيا بتأويل الجمهور للنص المسرحي. شكرا.
طيب باختصار مفيد. طيب أنا أشكركم أولا على المداخلات المتجانسة بالسيناريو والرقصة والأزياء، كما أشكر المتدخلين كثرتهم تفيد التفاعل مع الجلسة. لملاحظة طريفة: هل المقاومة خصيصا للرجال؟ الرقصة ركزت على الرجال فقط، وأنا سجلت ملاحظات بخصوص مواسم الرماء والتوريضة في مجموع ربوع المملكة. باستمرار الرجل هو المقاوم، ما موقع المرأة؟ سلام.
شكرا على الأسئلة. حقيقة الكثير من الأسئلة موجهة لزميل الدكتور شامي، وسوف نبدأ من سؤال الدكتور مهنا إلى الأستاذ عبد المجيد، ثم ننتقل إلى الأستاذ شامي. تفضل.
شكرا. بالنسبة للسؤال الأول، في المعهد العالي للفن المسرحي والتنشيط الثقافي عادة هناك عدة تخصصات، ولكن أساسا هناك تكوين لمدة 2 يتم فيه تكوين طلبة وتكوين عام لجميع التخصصات، بمعنى أن هناك روابط جيدة ما بين الشعب. ليست لنا شعبة نقد أو شعبة كتابة، ولكن أساسا شعبة تشخيص وشعبة تنشيط ثقافي. وإذن دائما هناك هذا التقاسم، تقاسم التجربة والخبرة والمقترحات الفنية ما بين هذا وذاك. السينوغرافيون أيضا ينجزون الأعمال التي يشتغل عليها طلبة التشخيص عادة. بالنسبة للسؤال الثاني، المسارح الكبرى هي بنايات مؤسساتية، لا سواء الكبرى أو الصغرى. مداخلتي كانت تلح على إثارة هذه النقطة، بأن المسارح أولا لا تنتج أعمال الفرق، بمعنى أن التجربة المسرحية في المغرب هي تجربة لقيطة، بمعنى أن الفرق هي تعيش في أماكن غير مهيئة للعمل. وإذن نحن كفنانين نشعر بالاغتراب أمام هذه البنايات الضخمة المثيرة، وتعذر أن يتم إنتاج فيها أعمال مسرحية. نحن زائرون عبر جميع المسارح، وليست هناك حتى مسارح صغرى التي تأوي الفنانين والمبدعين. بالنسبة للسؤال عن العلاقة ما بين السينوغراف والمؤلف، هي أساسا العلاقة ما بين السينوغراف والمخرج، لأن السينوغراف لا يتدخل، يقترح طبعا، ولكن انطلاقا من تصور يضعه المخرج أساسا، وهما يشتركان في عملية تطوير أو إنضاج هذا التصور طبعا معا. لذلك يسمى دائما السينوغراف مخرج سري للعمل.
شكرا لك دكتور. كثير من الأسئلة، ولكن أرجو أن تشمل جميع هذه الأسئلة خلال 3 دقائق شاملة إن شاء الله. شكرا.
3 minutes. شكرا على الأسئلة. غنحاول نذكر شكون اللي سألني ونحاول ندمج ما بين العربية والإنجليزية. I'm going to start here with you asking about the presence of these particular dances in social events like weddings. And I think the word we're looking for is tokenism. And I think Al-Arabi has, one of Lahsan's quote was like, we're here for the folklore. We're here because they just want to show that, hey, we are proud of our Ghibli roots. But all in all, it's just that. As a matter of fact, that particular wedding that I attended, they were quoted for 6 to 8 musicians, and they only have budget for 2. So they end up bringing 4 and splitting the pay between the 4 of them. So we had 4 people, presenting 16 musicians on stage. So yeah, there is a lot of tokenism happening in there. As to your question about how it intensifies, you asked whether it was tempo and or melody or volume, and the answer is all of the above. When music intensifies on stage, it obviously, covers a lot of things. So yeah, the tempo gets faster. We move from the aita to, a bit more upbeat songs with a bit more energy, and they're also a bit louder. بالنسبة للسؤال ديال الأستاذ, it was also in English, on the solutions. I'm not a policymaker, but it's funny because every time I'm on this stage, I'm being asked the same thing. Last time we were talking about the Aita, and someone asked me the exact same question. What are the solutions? Well, let's not reinvent the wheel. This is a form of art, and just like anything else, in order for it to, it's a living thing. So it needs to be documented, it needs to be recorded, it needs to be presented, it needs to also be talked about. We've had recently, on the الإذاعة والتلفزة المغربية, a whole documentary on الغيطة بالمغرب. And it was like a 35-minute documentary. And we heard very little music in it. And more aggravating to me personally, there was nothing from anything north of العريش. So it was mostly الغيطة in جبال الأطلس. So yeah, there's also a bit of tahmish that could be avoided. There's also a bit of like marginalization that we can do without. You talked earlier about Mohammed bin Ziyan. I'm very sadly, the only documentation that it's available to me is a dissertation on Mohammed bin Ziyan at University of New Orleans. I was trying to get the name of the scholar, but yeah, we have these figures, Hamid al-Sukan, about whom nothing is available. So maybe it starts with documentation. Maybe it starts with that. We all hear about, Wad al-Makhazin, Anwal, Harb Isli. Nobody hears about, Wad al-Bin, which involved like 300 fierce Jibala warriors that were specifically called upon. And hardly, Abdullah Ghalib, who was facing the Uthmaniyin, and he was about to lose the city of Fez. What did he do? He summoned the local sheikh, Sidi Ali al-Hajj, basically telling him, هادو راه جوج خلاو ضربويا وإذا كليت العصا من عندهم encore une deuxième fois راه غياخدوا فاس. So summon your best warriors. وصفت دي زيميسير، صفت الرسل القبائل الجبالة، قال لهم اعطوني 300 الناس اللي ما يعقلوش على الحموم اللي يقدروا يعاونونا في هذا. Anecdotally, and it's important to me as a musician, as the ethnomusicologist, he asked every single tribe to send 10 to 15 men, and he asked Bni Sarif to send 10 to 15 musicians, غياطة. And that started like the protocol with the Sa'diyin. I don't want to forget anybody. It's going to take 30 more seconds. As far as Raqsat Siniya, if you go back to very early postcards from Tanja, 1930s, 1920, you'll find these postcards advertising for Hotel Marhaba. What do you see? Little kid with Siniya فوق راسه, فوق من الشماع, فوق من كيسان داتاي, and it's a dance that is it's not by no means specific to the Jibala region. It exists in other regions in Morocco. I happen to talk about the Jibala because I'm Jibli. But yeah, it's usually they have like Siniya, كيكون فوق من الشماع وكيسان داتاي, and they do like very acrobatic dances without, try to drop that. I'll happily address everything else separately in أستاذتي الحالية. Thank you.
شكرا عدونا اللدود أبدا ودائما الوقت. شكرا لتفاعلكم وحضوركم. شكرا.